Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Curiosities. I'm so glad you're here. Maybe it's been a long day, or maybe you just like to fall asleep thinking about the quiet details of the past. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. There's nothing you need to do now. Just let your body rest and your thoughts drift, because tonight we're exploring the past itself. We'll move gently from fact to fact. Some things may surprise you. Others may stay with you like a quiet thought at the edge of sleep. And if these calm explorations help you rest, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps others find their way here too. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. When we look up at the night sky and see the moon, it feels like a permanent, peaceful companion. But its origin story is one of dramatic transformation. About 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was a lonely planet drifting through space without a moon to guide its tides or stabilize its wobble. Scientists believe that a protoplanet roughly the size of Mars, which they have named Theia, was on a collision course with our young world. When they met, it wasn't a gentle merger, but a massive impact that liquefied the surface of the Earth and ejected a colossal amount of debris into orbit. For a brief window of time, our planet had a ring system much like Saturn's, made of molten rock and dust, spinning rapidly around the equator. Over time, gravity did its slow and steady work, pulling this ring of hot debris together. It coalesced into the glowing, spherical object we know today. It happened surprisingly fast in cosmic terms. Some simulations suggest the moon could have formed from the debris in just a matter of hours or months. Back then, the moon was much closer to us, dominating the sky with a terrifying grandeur. But over billions of years, it has slowly drifted away to its current, comfortable distance. It is a reminder that even the most peaceful things in our night sky were born from the chaotic creativity of the early universe. A beautiful scar that became our nightlight. Before the Earth was the blue marble or the green jewel we recognize today, there's a fascinating hypothesis that our planet was actually purple. This idea, known as the purple Earth hypothesis, suggests that long before green plants appeared, the oceans were teeming with a different kind of microbial life. Today, plants use a green pigment called chlorophyll to absorb sunlight and create energy, reflecting green light back to our eyes. But 3 billion years ago, the dominant life forms may have been single-celled organisms called halobacteria. These tiny beings used a different molecule, retinol, to harvest the sun's energy. Retinol is easier to produce in low oxygen environments, and it absorbs green light most efficiently while reflecting red and violet light. If you were floating in a spaceship above the Earth during this era, looking down at the oceans, you wouldn't see the deep blues and greens of the modern world. Instead, you would likely see vast, vibrant oceans of violet and purple, stretching from pole to pole. It paints a picture of a truly alien world, one that existed right here, under the same sun, but with a completely different chemistry of life. Eventually, chlorophyll-based life evolved and proved to be more efficient, slowly turning the purple tide into the green biosphere we know. But for a long time, the Earth wore a different coat, waiting for the future to change its colors. The color of life changes with time, just as the seasons do. The sky above us hasn't always been the calm, familiar blue we see on a clear day once. It was a hazy, alien orange. This was the state of our atmosphere during the Archean Eon, a time when the air was thick with methane and devoid of the oxygen we breathe today. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and in the early atmosphere, it created a thick hydrocarbon smog, similar to what we see on Saturn's moon, Titan, today. This orange haze would have scattered sunlight differently, bathing the prehistoric surface in a dim, reddish glow. Then came one of the most significant turning points in history, known as the Great Oxygenation Event. Tiny microorganisms called cyanobacteria began to photosynthesize, taking in sunlight and releasing oxygen as a waste product. For millions of years, this oxygen was absorbed by the iron in the oceans and rocks, literally trusting the world. But eventually, it began to fill the air. As the oxygen levels rose, it reacted with the methane, breaking it down and clearing the heavy orange smog. Slowly, the haze lifted, revealing the transparency of the nitrogen and oxygen atmosphere we have now. The sky turned from a dusty orange to a brilliant, deep blue. It was a chemical revolution that changed the way light touched the surface of our world forever. The first deep breath of the world we know today. There's a quiet mystery in the history of our solar system known as the faint young sun paradox. Stars, like living things, change as they age, and our sun is no exception. Billions of years ago, when the solar system was in its infancy, our sun was roughly 70% as bright as it is today. It was a smaller, dimmer star, casting much less heat across the void of space. Based on simple physics, this lower energy output means that the early Earth should have been a frozen ball of ice, locking all water into solid glaciers and preventing life from taking hold. However, the geological record tells a different story. We find evidence of liquid water and sedimentary rocks from this very era, proving that rivers flowed and oceans waved under that faint, distant star. The solution to this paradox likely lies in the blanket of our atmosphere. Ancient Earth likely had a much thicker layer of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane, that trapped whatever meager heat the young sun provided. It was a delicate planetary embrace that kept the world warm enough for water to flow, even when the hearth of the solar system was burning low. Without this perfect atmospheric insulation, Earth might have remained a snowball forever. It shows how the planet and the star grew up together, balancing each other through eons of change. A gentle warmth, growing slowly over billions of years. We often wish there were more hours in the day, but if we traveled back to the Earth's beginning, we would find ourselves in a dizzying rush of daylight and darkness. Shortly after the moon formed, the Earth was spinning much faster than it does now. Scientists estimate that a single day on early Earth lasted only about 4 to 6 hours. This means the sun would rise, race across the sky, and set in just 2 or 3 hours, followed by a brief, rapid night. Reason for this frantic pace was the energy left over from the massive collisions that formed the planet and the moon. But over the last 4 billion years, a slow and steady braking force has been at work, the moon. As the moon orbits us, its gravity pulls on our oceans, creating tides. This tidal friction acts like a gentle brake on the Earth's rotation, stealing a tiny bit of momentum and transferring it to the moon, pushing it slightly further away. This process is incredibly slow, lengthening the day by just under 2 milliseconds every century. But over eons, those milliseconds added up, stretching our day from a frantic 6 hours to the leisurely 24 hours we enjoy now. The rhythm of life slowed down, allowing for longer sleeps and calmer weather patterns. A slow breaking of the world, settling into a peaceful rhythm. There was a time when our planet, usually a mix of green forests and blue oceans, looked more like a pristine white marble suspended in the dark. This period is known as Snowball Earth, occurring roughly 700 million years ago during the Cryogenian period. It wasn't just a typical ice age where glaciers crept down from the poles. In this extreme era, scientists believe the ice sheets advanced all the way to the equator. The entire planet was encased in a shell of ice, perhaps a kilometer thick, turning the Earth into a brilliant white reflector. Because white ice reflects sunlight back into space, an effect known as high albedo, the planet couldn't absorb enough heat to melt the ice, creating a feedback loop that kept the world frozen for millions of years. It was a silent, cold epoch where the oceans were sealed off from the atmosphere. Life, which was mostly microscopic at the time, barely held on. It survived in small pockets of liquid water near volcanic vents, or under thin patches of ice where sunlight could still penetrate. It is strange to imagine the tropical zones we know today, places like the Amazon or Indonesia, buried under crushing sheets of ice. Eventually, volcanic eruptions pumped enough carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to trap heat and melt the shell, releasing the world from its frozen slumber. Life waiting patiently for the great thaw. We take the rain for granted, assuming it has always fallen from the clouds. But there was a very first time that rain touched the surface of our world. In the earliest days of Earth, shortly after it formed, the planet was a molten, hellish landscape with a surface temperature far too hot for liquid water to exist. Any water present was in the form of steam, filling the thick, heavy atmosphere with massive clouds of vapor. There were no oceans, no lakes, only a swirling envelope of hot gas. But as the Earth radiated its heat out into space, the surface began to cool. Eventually, the temperature dropped below the boiling point of water. At that moment, the steam in the atmosphere began to condense. The first clouds formed, heavy and dark, and the first drops of rain fell toward the hot rocks below. Once it started, it didn't stop. Scientists believe this primordial deluge, sometimes called the Great Rain, may have lasted for millions of years without pause. It was a storm of unimaginable scale. This endless rainfall filled the low-lying basins of the crust, slowly creating the first oceans. By the time the clouds finally broke and the rain slowed to a rhythm, the world was blue, covered in the water that would eventually nurture all life. The beginning of the water cycle, a circle that continues to this very night. Long before humanity walked the earth, and even before the first dinosaur took a breath, the planet looked like an alien world dominated by giant fungi. About 400 million years ago, if you stood on the ancient soil, you wouldn't see a forest of trees. Instead, you would see a landscape covered in low-lying mosses and liverworts, interrupted only by massive, towering spires known as prototaxites. These biological structures grew up to 8 meters tall and a meter wide, looming over the landscape like stone pillars. For decades after their discovery in 1859, scientists were baffled by what these fossils actually were, debating whether they were ancient conifers, rolled up mats of liverworts, or something else entirely. It wasn't until 2007 that chemical analysis confirmed they were actually gigantic fungi, similar to mushrooms, but on a colossal scale. In this era, plants had not yet evolved deep roots or strong woody trunks, so these fungal giants were the largest living things on land for millions of years. They likely thrived by absorbing nutrients from the rocky soil and the microbial mats that carpeted the ground, growing slowly in a humid, quiet world. It paints a picture of a planet that is recognizably ours, yet fundamentally different, a silent, misty expanse where the trees were actually mushrooms, standing guard over a world waiting for the next stage of life to begin. A quiet kingdom of soft earth and silent, towering spores. There was a specific time in Earth's history when trees simply did not decay. This occurred during the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago, a name that literally refers to the rich coal deposits formed during this era. Vast swamp forests covered the continents, filled with scale trees and giant ferns that grew rapidly in the warm, humid climate. However, a crucial evolutionary lag had occurred. Trees had developed a tough, structural polymer called lignin to help them grow tall. But bacteria and fungi had not yet evolved the enzymes necessary to break lignin down. When these massive trees died and fell, they didn't rot and disappear as they do today. Instead, they simply piled up, layer upon layer, year after year, for millions of years. These undecomposed trunks formed immense beds of peat that were eventually buried and compressed by the weight of the earth, turning into the black coal that powered the Industrial Revolution eons later. Because the carbon in the wood wasn't being released back into the atmosphere through decay, oxygen levels in the atmosphere skyrocketed, creating air that was much richer than what we breathe today. It is a strange thought that the coal we burn today is essentially the fossilized remains of a forest that couldn't rot, capturing the sunlight of a summer that happened 300 million years ago. A preserved memory of a forest floor that never disappeared. The timeline of the dinosaurs is so vast that it breaks our intuitive sense of history. We often imagine all dinosaurs living together in a single prehistoric jungle, but the distance between different species is staggering. A perfect example is the relationship between the Stegosaurus and the Tyrannosaurus rex. The Stegosaurus, with its distinctive plated back and spiked tail, roamed the earth during the late Jurassic period, about 150 million years ago. It eventually went extinct long before the Cretaceous period began. The Tyrannosaurus rex, perhaps the most famous dinosaur of all, didn't appear until the late Cretaceous, roughly 66 million years ago. This means that nearly 84 million years separated these two animals. If a T-Rex were to walk past a fossilized Stegosaurus in the ground, that fossil would be more ancient to the T-Rex than the T-Rex is to us today. We are closer in time to the T-Rex by almost 20 million years than the T-Rex was to the Stegosaurus. The age of dinosaurs wasn't a single event, but a series of distinct eras stretching over 180 million years, with entire civilizations of species rising and falling without ever meeting one another. It reminds us that deep time is not just a long list of events, but a series of vast, separate worlds that occupied the same space at very different times. A separation of eras that feels almost like a separation of worlds. In the millions of years after the dinosaurs vanished, the warming planet gave rise to reptiles of terrifying proportions. Deep in the prehistoric rainforests of what is now Colombia, a snake of immense size slithered through the muddy waterways. Paleontologists named it Titanoboa, and it is the largest snake ever discovered in the history of the planet. While a modern anaconda might reach 20 feet in exceptional cases, the Titanoboa grew to a length of 42 feet, longer than a standard school bus, and weighed as much as a bridge, over a ton. Its fossils were found in the Sarajan Formation, an open-pit coal mine that has provided a treasure trove of information about this ancient tropical ecosystem. The existence of such a massive cold-blooded creature tells us something specific about the climate of that era. It had to be incredibly hot, since snakes rely on external heat to power their metabolism. A snake of that size would require an average ambient temperature of about 30 to 34 degrees Celsius just to survive. It was the apex predator of its time, likely feeding on giant turtles and primitive crocodiles, crushing them with immense constriction pressure. For 10 million years, this colossus ruled the equatorial rivers, a silent giant navigating the dark, warm waters of a jungle that has long since turned to coal. A slow-moving shadow in the heavy heat of the ancient earth. For a long time, we assumed that dinosaur eggs were plain white, similar to the eggs of modern reptiles like lizards or crocodiles. We imagined their nests as piles of monochrome shells hidden in the undergrowth. However, recent chemical analysis has painted a much more vibrant picture. Paleontologists analyzing the fossilized shells of oviraptorosaurs, bird-like dinosaurs from the late Cretaceous, discovered traces of two specific pigments, biliverdin and protoporphyrin. These are the exact same pigments that give modern bird eggs their blue and reddish-brown colors. This suggests that some dinosaurs laid eggs that were a brilliant blue-green, possibly speckled with dark brown spots, looking very much like the eggs of a modern robin or emu. This coloration likely served as camouflage. While reptiles often bury their white eggs underground for protection, birds, and apparently some dinosaurs, laid their eggs in open nests, where white shells would be dangerously visible to predators. The evolution of colored shells allowed the eggs to blend in with the dappled light and vegetation of the forest floor. It shifts our mental image of these ancient nurseries from hidden burrows to open, carefully guarded nests filled with clutches of beautiful, speckled blue eggs. It is a delicate detail that connects the fearsome giants of the past to the birds singing in our gardens today. A splash of color in the dangerous green of the Cretaceous. The story of the whale is one of the most remarkable evolutionary U-turns in history. Life began in the ocean, eventually moving onto land, but the ancestors of whales decided to go back. About 50 million years ago, the ancestor of the modern whale was a creature called Pakistus, a four-legged land animal that looked somewhat like a wolf or a large deer. It lived near the edges of intense bodies of water in what is now Pakistan and India. Over millions of years, these animals began spending more time in the water to escape predators or find food. Slowly, their bodies adapted. Their legs shortened and transformed into flippers. Their tails grew strong and broad for propulsion, and their nostrils migrated from the tip of their snouts to the top of their heads to form blowholes. We can still see the evidence of this transition in whale skeletons today, deep within their bodies, suspended in muscle and completely useless, are tiny remnants of pelvic bones, the lingering architectural memory of the hips that once supported walking legs. They are mammals that returned to the sea, carrying the legacy of their time on land in their bones and their need to breathe air. It is a journey of adaptation that spans eons, a return to the cradle of life by a creature that had once conquered the dry. A long, slow swim back to the beginning. Before the sky belonged to birds, it was the domain of insects that grew to sizes that seem impossible today. In the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago, a dragonfly-like creature called Meganeura hummed through the air. It was a predator of the skies, with a wingspan stretching more than 70 centimeters, or nearly 2.5 feet, roughly the size of a modern hawk or crow. If one were to land on your arm today, it would cover it entirely from shoulder to wrist. The primary reason these insects could grow so large lies in the atmosphere itself. Insects do not have lungs like we do. They breathe through tiny openings in their bodies, called spiracles, which passively transport oxygen to their tissues. This system becomes inefficient at large sizes in our current atmosphere. However, during the Carboniferous period, oxygen levels were much higher, peaking around 35% compared to today's 21%. This dense, oxygen-rich air allowed giant insects to power their massive bodies without suffocating. Meganeura was a voracious hunter, likely feeding on smaller insects and amphibians, ruling the air in a time before birds had evolved to challenge them. The sound of their wings beating would have been a deep, low thrumming, the background noise of the ancient swamp forests, a heavy, rhythmic sound in the thick, rich air of a younger Earth. For nearly 1 million years, the nights were darker than we can truly imagine, until a single discovery changed the shape of human existence forever. This was the controlled use of fire, a turning point that did far more than just provide warmth. While lightning strikes had always created natural fires, the moment our ancestors learned to capture, maintain, and eventually create flame at will, they fundamentally altered their own biology. Before fire, early humans spent a massive portion of their waking hours chewing tough, raw meat and fibrous plants to extract enough energy to survive. Cooking changed this equation entirely. By heating food, they broke down complex proteins and starches before they even entered the mouth, effectively predigitizing their meals. This released a surge of calories with far less effort, and scientists believe this surplus energy allowed the human brain to grow rapidly in size and complexity. But the fire did something else too. It extended the day. Instead of sleeping as soon as the sun set, people gathered around the hearth. In that circle of flickering light, protected from the predators in the shadows, they began to tell stories, share wisdom, and build the complex social bonds that hold us together today. The campfire was the first school, the first theater, and the first home. A spark that pushed back the night and allowed us to become who we are. Music is often thought of as a luxury of civilization, but the desire to create melody is actually older than the first permanent settlement. In a cave in southern Germany called Hohl Fels, archaeologists discovered a delicate flute carved from the wing bone of a griffon vulture. This instrument is at least 40,000 years old, dating back to the bitter cold of the last ice age. Creating it was an act of incredible precision and patience. The maker had to smooth the hollow bone, carve a V-shaped mouthpiece, and drill perfectly spaced finger holes without shattering the fragile material. When researchers built a replica and played it, they found it produced a range of notes similar to modern flutes, with a haunting, breathy sound that would have echoed beautifully against the stone walls of the cave. It is profound to think that amidst the struggle for survival hunting mammoths, enduring freezing temperatures, and avoiding predators, these early humans took the time to create art. They weren't just surviving, they were expressing something. Music likely served as a way to bond the group, to celebrate, or perhaps to soothe fear during the long, dark winters. Before we built cities or wrote down laws, we were already making songs in the dark, sending melodies out into the prehistoric silence. Before we built houses or planted crops, we made a friend that would walk beside us for the rest of history. The domestication of the dog is the oldest agricultural partnership in existence, occurring roughly 20,000 to 40,000 years ago. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't a matter of humans capturing wolves. Rather, it was likely a gradual process of mutual curiosity and benefit. Braver, less aggressive wolves began following human hunting camps to scavenge for leftover scraps. Over generations, these wolves became more comfortable with humans, and humans realized that these animals could provide an alarm system against predators and help track game. As the bond deepened, the animals changed physically. Their ears became softer, their coats more varied, and they developed a unique muscle above their eyes that allows them to make puppy dog eyes, a trait that specifically triggers a nurturing response in human brains. This partnership was so successful that dogs spread across the world with humans, helping us conquer new environments. In the bitter cold of the Ice Age, dogs provided warmth at night. In the hunt, they provided speed and senses we lacked. It is a relationship written into our very evolution. Two different species that chose to face the world together, sharing the fire and the watch. In the glistening white gypsum sands of New Mexico, a ghost from the deep past was recently found, capturing a fleeting moment of intimacy that lasted for 23,000 years. These are the white sands footprints, and they tell a specific story that feels incredibly modern despite its age. The tracks show a young adult, likely a woman or an adolescent male, walking a long distance across the muddy edge of an ancient lake. What makes the tracks heartbreakingly real is that for part of the journey, the footprints deepen and shift in weight, and a set of tiny toddler tracks appears alongside them. Then, the toddler tracks disappear, and the adult's tracks deepen again. The walker was carrying the child, shifting them from hip to hip, then setting them down to walk on their own for a while, just as any parent does today. These footprints were made during the height of the last glacial maximum, a time when massive ice sheets covered much of North America. The tracks also intersect with those of a giant ground sloth and a mammoth, showing that these humans were navigating a world of megafauna. For thousands of years, these prints were hidden, waiting for the wind to scour away the topsoil and reveal this long, tired walk. A momentary struggle with a heavy child preserved in stone. We often credit stone tools or fire for our survival, but a much smaller, sharper invention allowed us to conquer the coldest corners of the planet. Around 50,000 years ago, humanity invented the eyed needle. Before this tiny tool, clothing was likely just animal hides draped over the shoulders and tied clumsily with strips of leather. This provided some warmth, but it left gaps where the freezing wind could penetrate, making survival in the high Arctic or during deep glacial periods nearly impossible. The invention of a needle with a hole for thread allowed for true tailoring. Humans could now sew multiple skins together to create fitted garments, pants, parkas with hoods, and boots that hugged the body. This seemingly simple shift created a trapped layer of warm air against the skin, functioning exactly like a modern thermal wetsuit or high-tech winter gear. The needles were crafted from bone or ivory, polished to a smooth finish to avoid snagging the leather. With this technology, humans could finally venture into the frozen north and cross the land bridge into the Americas. It was a technological leap as significant as the wheel, yet it could be held between two fingertips. We stitched our way through the Ice Age, one loop at a time. Deep underground, far from the light of the sun and the moon, early humans created some of their most stunning masterpieces in total darkness. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet in France are not located near the cave entrances where people lived. Instead, they are often found hundreds of meters deep inside the earth, in chambers that would have been pitch black without artificial light. To create these images, artists had to carry torches or burn animal fat in stone lamps, navigating narrow, twisting passages to reach their canvas. The placement suggests that these paintings were not merely decoration, but part of a sacred or ritualistic experience. In the flickering light of a torch, the paintings interact with the uneven rock surfaces in a way that makes the animals appear to move. Bison painted over a bulging rock looks like it is breathing. A herd of horses seems to gallop as the shadows shift. The acoustic properties of these deep chambers are often special as well, amplifying sound in ways that might have accompanied the viewing of the art. These ancient people went to great lengths to dream in the dark, leaving their handprints and their visions in places where the sun would never touch them. A secret gallery meant for the flicker of fire and the eyes of the initiate. For a long time, we believed that we were the only distinct version of humanity to survive, but modern science has revealed that we are actually a tapestry of different lineages. The Neanderthals, once dismissed as brutish and unintelligent, were actually our close cousins, and for thousands of years, our ranges overlapped in Europe and Asia. We now know that they were sophisticated. They buried their dead, cared for the injured, made jewelry, and perhaps even spoke. But the most surprising discovery came from mapping the genome. When modern humans moved out of Africa and encountered Neanderthals, we didn't just fight or ignore them, we connected with them. Today, almost everyone of non-African descent carries between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. They are not entirely gone. Their genes live on in us, influencing things like our immune systems, our hair, and our ability to adapt to different climates. It completely changes how we view the past. We are not the lone survivors of a single straight line, but the result of a braided river of humanity. We carry the ghosts of other human species in our very blood, a biological memory of a time when we were not the only ones like us on Earth. It is a strange and humorous comfort to know that the oldest written customer service complaint in history is nearly 4,000 years old. In the ancient city of Ur, around 1750 BCE, a man named Nani was incredibly frustrated with a merchant named Enasir. The dispute wasn't about a broken phone or a late delivery, but about the quality of copper ingots that Enasir had supplied. Nani was so upset that he didn't just complain to a neighbor. He took the time to inscribe his grievances onto a clay tablet in cuneiform script. He wrote, "What do you take me for, that you treat somebody like me with such contempt?" He went on to detail how Enasir had been rude to his servant and had delivered substandard copper, all while keeping Nani's money. What makes this story so fascinating is not just the pettiness of the dispute, but the accidental immortality it granted to a bad businessman. Because the tablet was written on clay and then baked, possibly during a fire that destroyed the building, it survived for millennia in the ruins of the city. Today, that tablet sits in the British Museum, a permanent testament to Enasir's questionable business practices. It reminds us that while technology changes, human nature remains remarkably consistent. We have been demanding to speak to the manager for as long as we have had cities. a moment of frustration, frozen in earth, outlasting the empire that created it. We often think of the wheel as the invention that started everything moving, but for the first few centuries of its existence, the wheel went nowhere. The earliest evidence of the wheel, dating back to around 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia, wasn't used for transportation at all. It was used for pottery. Before anyone thought to turn a wheel on its side and attach it to a cart, they used it to spin clay into bowls and vases. This makes sense when you consider the engineering challenge of a vehicle. Creating a rolling wheel is easy, but connecting that wheel to a stationary platform with an axle is incredibly difficult. You need the wheel to rotate freely while supporting a heavy load, without the friction generating so much heat that the wood catches fire. It took roughly 300 years after the invention of the potter's wheel for someone to figure out the axle mechanism required for chariots and wagons. Once they did, civilization could move goods and people across vast distances, fundamentally changing trade and warfare. But for those first few hundred years, the wheel was a tool of stillness and creation, spinning quietly in a workshop, helping a potter shape a vessel from the mud of the riverbank. It was an instrument of art long before it was an instrument of speed. In the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, beer was not just a drink. It was a foundational part of society and a gift from the gods. The Sumerians took brewing so seriously that they had a goddess of beer named Ninkasi. One of the oldest surviving recipes in the world is actually a poem known as the Hymn to Ninkasi, dating back to around 1800 BCE. This hymn describes the process in loving detail, from handling the dough with a shovel to mixing it with sweet aromatics and fermenting it in a great vat. The beer they produced was quite different from what we know today. It was often thick, porridge-like, and full of sediment from the grains and bread used to make it. To drink it without swallowing the solid bits, the Sumerians invented another tool we still use, the drinking straw. Ancient depictions show people sitting around a large communal jar, sipping the liquid through long reeds made of gold or lapis, lazuli for the wealthy, and simple river reeds for everyone else. This beverage was safer to drink than the often contaminated water of the canals, and it was even used as a form of currency to pay workers. It was a source of nutrition and joy, a daily ritual that brought people together in the shade of mud brick houses, a liquid bread that fueled the building of the first cities. Warfare is as old as humanity, but the formal agreement to end it has a specific birthplace in history. The first recorded peace treaty that has survived to the present day was forged between two superpowers of the ancient world, the Egyptian Empire and the Hittite Empire. After years of conflict and the massive but inconclusive Battle of Kadesh, Pharaoh Ramses II and King Hattusili III decided that diplomacy was more profitable than bloodshed. In 1259 BCE, they drafted a text that promised not only to end hostilities, but to form an alliance. The treaty included improved regulations for the extradition of refugees and a promise of mutual defense. If one empire was attacked, the other would come to its aid. What is particularly beautiful about this agreement is that we have found copies of it from both sides. The Egyptian version was carved in hieroglyphics on the walls of temples, while the Hittite version was inscribed on baked clay tablets found in their capital in modern-day Turkey. They say almost the same thing, a rare moment where two sides of a conflict agreed on the truth. A copy of this ancient treaty is now displayed at the United Nations headquarters in New York, a bronze symbol of the enduring hope that enemies can eventually find a way to share the world, a promise of peace etched in silver and stone. The skyline of ancient Mesopotamia was dominated not by skyscrapers, but by ziggurats, massive terraced structures that looked like man-made mountains. Unlike the Egyptian pyramids, which were tombs built of stone to seal the dead away, ziggurats were built of mud brick and were designed to be climbed. They were immense stairways connecting the earth to the heavens. The most famous of these, the Great Ziggurat of Ur, had a base that covered an area equal to several modern football fields. Because the region lacked stone, the builders had to use millions of sun-baked bricks, which were vulnerable to the rain. To protect them, they faced the exterior with fired bricks glazed with bitumen, a naturally occurring tar, to make them waterproof. At the very top stood a temple, a waiting room for the gods. The people believed that the god would descend from the sky to dwell in this high place, bridging the gap between the divine and the mortal. These structures required constant maintenance. The mud bricks would shift and erode over centuries, requiring kings to rebuild what their ancestors had made. It was a project that spanned generations, a community effort to raise the ground itself up to the sky. They were solid, heavy, and imposing, serving as a reminder that the city was under the protection of something larger than any human king. The invention of writing is perhaps the most profound shift in human history, but it didn't start with poetry or philosophy. It started with accounting. In the bustling cities of Sumer, around 3400 BCE, administrators needed a way to keep track of grain, sheep, and beer. They began by pressing tokens into wet clay, but eventually they realized they could use a cut reed to make marks directly on the clay surface. Script became known as cuneiform, named after the Latin word for wedge, because of the triangular shape the reed left in the soft earth. Over centuries, these simple accounting marks evolved into a complex system capable of expressing abstract thoughts, emotions, and stories. The durability of this medium is the only reason we know so much about them. Unlike papyrus or paper, which decay in humid climates, clay tablets, when baked, become like stone. We have hundreds of thousands of these tablets, grocery lists, school exercises, royal decrees, and personal letters waiting in basements of museums to be read. Some even show the teeth marks of bored students who chewed on their styluses while daydreaming in class. It was the first time humanity could freeze a thought in time, separating the message from the messenger. A voice that could speak long after the throat was dust. Law is often an abstract concept, but in ancient Babylon, it was a physical object you could touch. The Code of Hammurabi, created around 1750 BCE, is one of the earliest and most complete written legal codes. It wasn't hidden away in a royal archive. It was carved onto a massive, 7-foot-tall stele of black diorite stone and placed in a public temple for everyone to see. At the top of the stone, a carving depicts King Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the sun god of justice, symbolizing that these rules were divine and unchangeable. The code consists of 282 specific laws, covering everything from trade and family to property and assault. This is where the famous principle of an eye for an eye comes from, though the application often depended on social status. A wealthy man might pay a fine for harming a commoner, while a commoner would suffer physical punishment. Despite its harshness by modern standards, The code introduced the revolutionary concept of the presumption of innocence. An accuser had to provide evidence, or they themselves would face the penalty. It was a move away from arbitrary tribal revenge toward a system of state-administered justice. The stone stands today as a dark, polished mirror of a society trying to create order out of chaos, a monument to the idea that fairness should be written down. For centuries, a persistent story has suggested that the Great Pyramids of Giza were built by the breaking backs of enslaved people, driven by the whip of a tyrant. However, archaeology has revealed a much more human and cooperative reality hidden beneath the sands. We now know that these massive structures were constructed by a paid workforce of skilled artisans and temporary laborers who were respected for their contribution to a national project. Excavations near the pyramids uncovered a vast purpose-built city, a workers' village that housed thousands of people who were fed a high-quality diet of prime beef, bread, and beer rations that would have been far too expensive for enslaved populations. We have even found their medical records written in bone. Skeletons from the site show evidence of complex surgeries, such as set fractures and amputations that healed cleanly, indicating they received excellent medical care. Graffiti left inside the hidden chambers of the pyramids tells us they organized themselves into competing teams with spirited names like the Drunkards of Menkora or the Friends of Khufu. It wasn't fear that raised those stones, but a deep sense of spiritual duty and national pride. For the ancient Egyptians, building the pharaoh's tomb was an act of ensuring cosmic order, or mad, and participating in it was a way to secure one's own place in the afterlife. It was a labor of devotion, a vast community coming together to build a mountain that would bridge the earth and the sky. Time often feels like a straight line, but when we look at the timeline of ancient Egypt, history begins to fold in on itself in surprising ways. Consider the life of Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. She is one of history's most famous figures, often associated in our minds with the ancient grandeur of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Yet Cleopatra actually lived closer in time to the moon landing of 1969 than she did to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid was completed around 2560 BCE, while Cleopatra was born around 69 BCE, a gap of roughly 2,500 years. In contrast, the time between her death and the Apollo 11 mission is just over 2,000 years. This means that when Cleopatra looked out over the Nile at the pyramids, she was looking at ancient ruins that were already older to her than the Roman Colosseum is to us today. She would have regarded them as relics of a distant, almost mythical past, constructed by ancestors whose methods were already becoming obscure. This distortion of time reminds us of the sheer longevity of Egyptian civilization, which thrived for 30 centuries, a span of time so vast that it contained its own eras of ancient history within itself. The monuments were old before the Greeks arrived, old before the Romans arrived, and they remain, watching the centuries pass like drifting sand. Deep inside the tombs of the pharaohs, amidst the gold masks and linen-wrapped mummies, archaeologists have discovered ceramic pots that contain a substance defying the laws of decay. They found honey that is 3,000 years old and, remarkably, still perfectly edible. In the early 20th century, excavators who opened these sealed jars reported that the golden liquid inside still retained its distinct scent, and for the brave few who tasted it, its sweetness. Honey is one of the only foods on earth that never spoils if kept in a sealed container. Its longevity comes from a perfect chemical balance. It is extremely low in water and naturally acidic, creating an environment where bacteria and spoilage microorganisms simply cannot survive. Furthermore, the bees add an enzyme that produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide, acting as a natural preservative. For the ancient Egyptians, this eternal quality made honey a sacred substance, a food of the gods, associated with tears of the sun god Ra. It was buried with the dead, not just as a snack for the long journey to the afterlife, but as a symbol of immortality itself. While the empires that harvested it have turned to dust, and the language spoken by the beekeepers has faded into silence, the honey remains unchanged, a golden drop of summer sunlight preserved from a time when the world was young. When we picture the Great Sphinx of Giza today, we imagine a monochromatic statue of beige limestone blending into the desert palette of tan and gold. But if we could travel back 4,500 years, we would be greeted by a vibrant, technicolor spectacle that would stand out starkly against the dunes. Traces of pigment found near the statue's ear and in the surrounding debris suggest that the Sphinx was once brightly painted. Face and body were likely a deep reddish brown, mimicking the suntanned skin of the pharaoh it represented. The Neem's headdress, the cloth folded over the head, would have been striped in brilliant yellow, and a blue perhaps meant to imitate lapis lazuli. Even the broad collar around its neck would have been detailed in reds, blues, and greens. In the bright Egyptian sun, these colors would have been dazzling, making the Sphinx a beacon visible from miles away. Over thousands of years, the scouring wind, the stinging sand, and the baking sun stripped this paint away, returning the stone to its natural state. It is a reminder that the ancient world was not a place of white marble and bare stone, as our museums often display, but a world of vivid, saturated color temples and statues painted in chaotic, beautiful hues that celebrated life in defiance of the desert's quiet monotony. The striking heavy black eyeliner worn by ancient Egyptians is one of the most recognizable fashion statements in history, seen on everyone from pharaohs to common laborers. But this makeup, known as kohl, was far more than a cosmetic choice. It was a sophisticated piece of ancient technology. The black paste was created by grinding galena, a lead sulfide mineral, and mixing it with other ingredients like pearls, animal fat, or gum. Its primary purpose was practical. The dark color around the eyes helped to reduce the glare of the relentless desert sun, much like the grease paint used by modern athletes. But recent chemical analysis has revealed an even deeper purpose. The lead-based compounds in the kohl, when mixed with the moisture of the eye, produced low levels of nitric oxide, which stimulates the immune system. This helped protect the Egyptians from common eye infections caused by the flooding of the Nile and the bacteria carried by marsh flies. By wearing this makeup, they were warding off disease, effectively creating an antibacterial shield. They believed the makeup invoked the protection of the gods Horus and Ra, and in a way, it did. Science and spirituality were blended into a single black line that offered safety in a harsh environment. In the mud brick homes and limestone temples of the Nile Valley, cats were viewed with a reverence that went far beyond their role as pets. They were considered sacred vessels, living representations of the goddess Bastet, who presided over home, fertility, and protection. The relationship began practically. Cats were the guardians of the grain silos, protecting the food supply from rats, mice, and venomous cobras. This vital service elevated them to a divine status. To harm a cat in ancient Egypt, even accidentally, was often considered a capital offense, punishable by death. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that when a household cat died of natural causes, the entire human family would enter a period of deep mourning, shaving off their eyebrows as a public sign of their grief. They would lament the loss until their eyebrows grew back. These beloved animals were often mummified with the same care as humans, wrapped in fine linen and treated with cedar oil and spices, then placed in special cemeteries with milk and mice to sustain them. Millions of these mummies have been found, a testament to a society that recognized the dignity of the animal world. It was a unique social contract where the cat was not owned, but served a small, purring deity that was welcomed by the fire. The architectural precision of the ancient Egyptians is perhaps most evident in how they aligned their temples and pyramids with the night sky. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy that is almost impossible to comprehend, deviating by only 3/60ths of a degree. This is even more remarkable when we realize they had no compasses, no GPS, and no modern optical instruments. Instead, they watched the stars. Specifically, they tracked the imperishable stars, the circumpolar stars that never dipped below the horizon, and the star Thuban, which was the pole star at the time, sitting where Polaris sits today. A ceremony known as stretching the cord was performed before any major temple was built, where the pharaoh and a priestess representing the goddess Seshat would use a simple looped rope and sighting stakes to establish the building's corners in harmony with the constellations. They believed that by aligning their monuments with the eternal, unchanging stars, they could draw down the stability of the heavens onto the earth. The layout of the 3 Giza pyramids is even thought by some to mirror the 3 stars of Orion's belt, creating a reflection of the celestial Jewett afterlife on the ground. They didn't just build tombs, they built a map of the sky in stone, anchoring their memory to the slow, silent rotation of the universe. Roman concrete has lasted over 2,000 years, defying the erosion that crumbles modern structures. The secret was hiding in volcanic ash and seawater all along. While modern concrete typically lasts about 50 to 100 years before the seawater begins to break it down, Roman structures like harbors and breakwaters have actually become stronger over the centuries. The Romans mixed volcanic ash from the region of Pozzuoli with lime and seawater in specific ratios that created something remarkable. When this mixture cured underwater, it didn't just harden, it actually evolved. Scientists discovered that the volcanic ash contained special materials that react with seawater over time, forming a rare mineral called aluminum tobermorate. These microscopic crystals grow inside the concrete, filling in tiny cracks and knitting the structure together like a self-healing rock. You can see the endurance of this material in the Pantheon, built around 126 CE, where the massive, unreinforced dome still spans 43 meters without any steel support. Walls start incredibly thick at the base, about 6 meters, and the concrete formulation changes as the building rises, using lighter volcanic stones near the top to reduce the weight. For nearly 2,000 years, that building has stood there, enduring earthquakes and the elements, while the concrete quietly strengthens itself on a chemical level. Modern engineers are now studying these ancient harbor samples, trying to recreate a formula that works with nature rather than against it. A simple mixture that turned the destructive power of the ocean into a source of enduring strength. Off the coast of a Greek island in 1901, sponge divers discovered a corroded lump of bronze that turned out to be the world's first analog computer. This device, known as the Antikythera mechanism, was resting at the bottom of the sea for 2,000 years, disguised as a greenish rock. When scientists finally peered inside using advanced X-ray imaging, they were stunned to find a complex system of at least 30 precision-cut bronze gears, some no larger than a coin. It dates back to the 2nd or 1st century BCE, yet it contained technology that wouldn't appear in Europe again for another 1,400 years, until the development of astronomical clocks in the Middle Ages. The mechanism wasn't just a clock, it was a dynamic model of the cosmos. By turning a hand crank on the side, a user could track the cycles of the solar system, predict the exact date and hour of future solar and lunar eclipses, and even track the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games. It accounted for the irregular orbit of the moon, speeding up and slowing down just as the moon does in the sky, using a pin and slot gear system that is genius even by modern standards. It suggests that the ancient world had a grasp of mechanics far more advanced than we ever gave them credit for. We only found one, but there were likely others, melted down for their bronze over the centuries, or lost in other shipwrecks. A lonely piece of genius that survived the silence of the ocean floor. In the militaristic city-state of Sparta, the definition of wealth was deliberately designed to be as inconvenient as possible. While the rest of the Greek world traded in shiny, portable coins of silver and gold, the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus introduced a currency made of heavy, brittle iron bars. These bars, sometimes called pelenoi, were not only cumbersome, but were treated in a specific way to ruin the metal. When the iron was red hot, it was quenched in a bath of vinegar, which changed the chemical structure of the metal and made it brittle and useless for any other purpose. You couldn't melt it down to make a sword, a plow, or a shield. It was valuable only as money within Sparta and completely worthless everywhere else. The intention was to make the accumulation of wealth difficult and socially embarrassing. To carry even a modest sum of money to the market, a Spartan would need a team of oxen and a wagon to haul the iron bars. This effectively discouraged bribery, theft, and foreign trade, as no merchant from another city wanted a pile of heavy, useless iron. It forced the Spartans to focus on what they valued most: military discipline, community, and the state, rather than the pursuit of personal luxury. It was a financial system built on the idea that true wealth wasn't what you could carry in your pocket, but what you could do without. A heavy reminder that the value of money is entirely a story we agree to tell. The color purple was once the most expensive substance on Earth, worth more than 3 times its weight in gold. In the ancient world, specifically within the Roman Empire, the rich shade known as Tyrian purple was a symbol of ultimate status and power. But the source of this majestic color was surprisingly humble and difficult to harvest. It came from the mucus of predatory sea snails from the murex family. Producing the dye was an industrial nightmare that required a staggering amount of marine life. To produce just 1 single ounce of the dye enough to perhaps color the trim of a single garment, workers had to crush over 12,000 individual snails. The process involved fermenting the snail glands in massive lead vats for days under the hot sun, creating a smell so overpowering and offensive that the dye factories had to be located miles away from the city walls. Yet the result was a color that didn't fade. In fact, it became brighter and more intense with exposure to sunlight and weathering. Because of the immense cost and labor involved, Roman emperors eventually issued decrees that only they were allowed to wear garments entirely dyed in this purple. It became a capital offense for a commoner to wear the color, which is why we still associate purple with royalty today. It was a hue manufactured from death and stench, transformed into the ultimate symbol of divine right, a beauty born from the depths of the sea, reserved for the highest of the high. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it didn't just preserve grand temples, it froze the most fragile details of daily breakfast. In the ruins of Herculaneum and Pompeii, archaeologists have found carbonized loaves of bread that are still intact after nearly 2,000 years. One famous loaf, discovered inside an oven where it was baking when the volcano erupted, still retains its round shape, scored into 8 sections like a pizza to make it easier to tear apart and share. But the most touching detail is the stamp on the top. Roman bakeries were required to mark their bread to prevent fraud and ensure quality, and this particular loaf bears the stamp, property of seller, slave of Q. Granius Verus. We know the name of the person who kneaded the dough and placed it in the heat, moments before the sky turned dark. The intense heat of the pyroclastic flow carbonized the bread instantly, turning it into pure carbon and removing all the moisture, which meant bacteria couldn't eat it and time couldn't rot it. It sits in a museum now, a dark, rocky disc that looks surprisingly appetizing, a ghost of a meal that was never eaten. It speaks to the suddenness of the event, life operating as normal, the dough rising, the oven warm, the stamp pressed, until time simply stopped. A humble morning ritual, preserved in ash for a future that seller could never have imagined. The Roman Empire was held together not just by legions, but by a road network so vast and well engineered that it wrapped around the earth nearly 4 times. At its height, the Romans constructed over 250,000 miles of roads, with about 50,000 miles of that being stone-paved highways. These weren't just dirt paths, they were major engineering projects built to last for centuries. Roman engineers dug deep trenches and filled them with 4 distinct layers. First, a foundation of sand or mortar, then layers of large stones, followed by gravel or crushed rock, and finally topped with smooth, interlocking paving stones. They were built with a slight hump in the center, known as a crown, which forced rainwater to drain off into ditches on the sides, preventing the road from becoming a muddy bog. This design was so effective that many modern roads still follow the exact same routes. And in some places in Europe, cars still drive over the original Roman foundations, buried deep beneath the asphalt. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was literally true. A golden milestone in the Roman Forum marked the center point from which all distances in the empire were measured. These straight, stone arteries allowed news, soldiers, and goods to travel at speeds that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the steam train. A stone web that shrank the world and bound 3 continents into one. The Great Library of Alexandria was more than just a building. It was an attempt to gather the entire memory of the human race in one place. Established in Egypt around the 3rd century BCE, the library's goal was to possess a copy of every book in the world. The hunger for knowledge was so aggressive that by royal decree, any ship arriving in the harbor of Alexandria was searched not just for contraband, but for scrolls. If a book was found, it was taken to the library, copied by scribes, and often the copy was given back to the owner while the library kept the original. At its peak, the shelves held hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls, containing the complete works of poets, astronomers, mathematicians, and historians, whose names we have now forgotten. We know it held the lost plays of Sophocles and Euripides, and perhaps the key to reading ancient languages that are now indecipherable. But the library wasn't destroyed in a single dramatic fire, as the movies often suggest. It suffered a slow, tragic decline over centuries through a series of fires, budget cuts, and wars. The loss is incalculable. It is estimated that we only have about 1% of the Greek literature that was stored there. The rest turned to ash or dust, leaving blank spaces in our history that we will likely never fill. A reminder of how fragile the collective memory of our species truly is, and how easily the voices of the past can be silenced. Long before modern skylines rose above the horizon, the city of Tenochtitlan floated on the surface of a vast lake, supported by an engineering marvel that turned water into solid ground. The Aztec people created something called chinampas, often described as floating gardens, though they were actually stable, artificial islands built with immense patience and skill. To create them, workers wove large reed mats and floated them in the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco, then piled rich mud and decaying vegetation from the lake bottom onto these rafts until they sat heavy and firm. But the true genius lay in how they anchored these islands. They planted fast-growing willow trees called ahujotes around the edges of each rectangular plot. As these trees grew, their dense root systems stretched down through the water and gripped the lakebed, acting as living concrete piles that locked the land in place. These gardens were incredibly fertile, allowing for up to 7 harvests a year, which is unheard of in standard agriculture. Farmers would paddle their canoes through the network of canals between the fields, tending to maize, beans, squash, and flowers that seemed to bloom directly from the water. This grid of canals also helped regulate the temperature, protecting crops from frost with a blanket of mist. It was a city of stone temples and vibrant markets, but its foundation was this quiet, watery latticework of roots and earth, feeding an empire from the lake itself. A civilization drifting gently on a mirror. High in the Andes Mountains, the Inca architects achieved a level of stone masonry that modern engineers still struggle to fully comprehend. They built massive walls and temples using stones that weighed up to 80 tons, fitting them together without a single drop of mortar or cement. The fit is so precise that even today, 500 years later, you cannot slide a thin knife blade or a piece of paper between the blocks. This wasn't just for aesthetics. It was a brilliant adaptation to one of the world's most seismically active regions. The Inca understood that rigid walls would snap and crumble when the earth shook, so they designed their structures to move. The stones were cut with irregular, interlocking shapes, almost like a complex 3D puzzle, and the walls were slightly tilted inward for stability. When an earthquake hits, The stones in an Inca wall actually dance. They bounce and shift slightly to dissipate the seismic energy. And then, as the shaking stops, gravity pulls them back into their perfect, interlocking positions. While Spanish colonial buildings, constructed with rigid mortar, collapsed repeatedly over the centuries, the ancient Inca foundations beneath them remained untouched. The workers shaped these stones using only harder stones and water, grinding them down with a patience we can scarcely imagine. It creates a sense of profound stillness to stand next to them, knowing these walls are waiting to catch the earth when it trembles. Stones that learned to breathe with the mountain. While Europe was still struggling with clumsy Roman numerals, the Maya civilization in Central America had already mastered a concept that is fundamental to the universe, but difficult for the human mind to grasp: the concept of zero. It seems simple to us now, but for most of human history, nothing was not considered a number that could be counted or written down. The Maya developed this idea independently, represented by a simple symbol that looked like a shell or a closed hand. This wasn't just a placeholder. It was a powerful mathematical tool that allowed them to perform complex calculations involving hundreds of millions of years. With this zero, they built the long count calendar, a system of timekeeping so precise that it could track the movements of the moon and Venus with an accuracy that rivals modern technology. Their astronomers would look up at the night sky from stone observatories, calculating the cycles of celestial bodies deep into the past and far into the future, all anchored by this concept of the empty space. It transformed mathematics from a simple way to count goods into a language that could describe the infinite. They understood that to measure the fullness of time, you first had to define the emptiness from which it began. It is a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful object in the room is the one that isn't there at all. The power of an empty space to hold everything else together. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, there's a mystery buried beneath the canopy that challenges the idea of the jungle as a purely untouched wilderness. For a long time, it was believed that the Amazon soil was too acidic and nutrient poor to support large civilizations. But researchers eventually discovered vast patches of something they call terra preta, or dark earth. This soil is not natural. It was manufactured by human hands thousands of years ago. Indigenous people created it by mixing charcoal, broken pottery, bone, compost, and manure into the ground, slowly transforming the yellow clay into a rich, black, sponge-like earth. This mixture is incredibly fertile, and remarkably, it regenerates itself. The charcoal acts like a coral reef for microscopic life, retaining nutrients and moisture for centuries. Some deposits of this soil are over 6 feet deep, suggesting that millions of people once lived and farmed in the heart of the forest, managing the landscape like a vast garden. When you hold a handful of this dark earth today, you are holding a technology of survival that has outlasted the names of the people who made it. It suggests that the wild Amazon was actually a cultivated home for generations, where people worked with the natural cycles to create abundance. The forest eventually reclaimed the cities, but the soil remains, a silent legacy of fertility waiting beneath the roots. A garden that outlived the gardeners. Spanning the spine of South America, the Inca Empire constructed a road system that rivals any infrastructure project in human history, all without the use of the wheel. The Quhapac Ñan, or the Great Inca Road, stretched for nearly 25,000 miles, crossing scorching deserts, thick jungles, and climbing some of the highest mountain passes on Earth. To navigate the steep Andean terrain, they built great staircases directly into the mountainsides and suspended bridges woven from woven grass across terrifying canyons. These grass bridges were engineering marvels, strong enough to hold marching armies and llama caravans, yet they were biodegradable and had to be rebuilt by local communities every year or two, a cycle of renewal that kept the connection alive. The road was the nervous system of the empire, allowing for communication speed that was faster than the postal systems of 18th century Europe. They used runners called chasquis, young men stationed at small huts every few miles. A message could be passed from runner to runner, relaying information from the capital in Cusco to the coast in a matter of days. Fresh fish caught in the Pacific Ocean could be delivered to the emperor's table in the high mountains before it spoiled, carried solely by human endurance. It was a network of stone and sweat that tied the clouds to the sea, proving that a civilization connects itself not just with paths, but with the shared effort to maintain them. A stone ribbon tying the mountains together. Along the banks of the Mississippi River, near what is now St. Louis, there once stood a bustling metropolis that was larger than London was at the same time. This city, known today as Cahokia, was the center of the Mississippian culture, reaching its peak around the 11th century. What makes Cahokia so fascinating is that it was built entirely of earth. The central structure, Monk's Mound, is a colossal earthen pyramid with a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, rising 100 feet into the air. To build it, thousands of laborers moved nearly 55 million cubic feet of soil, not with machinery or draft animals, but one woven basket at a time. They carried these heavy loads on their backs, day after day, piling the earth to create a platform that would lift their leaders closer to the sky. The city around this mound was vibrant and complex, featuring a circle of cedar posts known as Woodhenge that functioned as a solar calendar, marking the solstices and equinoxes with shadows. It was a hub of trade where people exchanged copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf of Mexico. And then, quite suddenly, the city was abandoned, leaving behind only these silent, grass-covered hills. Today, the mounds look like natural formations to the untrained eye, but they are the sleeping monuments of a great civilization. A skyline made of earth, resting under the open sky. Perhaps the greatest feat of genetic engineering in history happened not in a modern laboratory, but in the valleys of southern Mexico thousands of years ago. It began with a wild grass called teosinte, a plant that looks nothing like the food we know today. Teosinte has a hard, darker casing and produces a tiny ear with only about 5 to 12 kernels, which are so hard they can crack a tooth. It offers very little nutrition and seems entirely unpromising as a food source. Yet ancient farmers saw potential in this stubborn grass. Over thousands of years, through a process of careful observation and selection, they guided the evolution of the plant, choosing the seeds with the softest casings and the most kernels to replant each season. Slowly, gently, the plant transformed. The ears grew larger, the kernels softer and more numerous, until it became maize, what we call corn. This relationship is so close that corn has completely lost its ability to survive in the wild. The kernels remain trapped on the cob and cannot disperse without human hands to shuck and plant them. It is a plant that needs us as much as we need it. This partnership fueled the rise of the Aztec, Maya, and Inca empires, and eventually changed the diet of the entire world. Every field of corn waving in the wind today is a living memory of those ancient farmers who saw a future harvest hidden inside a blade of wild grass. A partnership between people and the land that grew into a golden sea. The invention of gunpowder was actually a happy accident in the search for eternal life. It began in 9th century China, where Taoist alchemists were meticulously mixing elements in search of an elixir that would grant immortality. They weren't trying to build a weapon, they were trying to defeat death itself. These early chemists experimented with 3 specific ingredients: sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. When they combined these powders in the right proportions and exposed them to an open flame, they didn't get a potion for everlasting youth. They got a sudden, brilliant flash and a puff of smoke. They called this volatile mixture Hyo, which translates to fire drug or fire medicine, a nod to its original medicinal purpose. For centuries, this discovery wasn't used for war, but for celebration and spiritual rituals. It was packed into bamboo shoots to create the world's first fireworks, aimed at warding off evil spirits with loud bangs and bright lights. It took hundreds of years before the formula was adapted for military use, and even then, it started as crude flamethrowers and simple rockets. It is a strange irony of history that the quest to live forever resulted in one of humanity's most powerful forces for change, starting as a flash of light in a quiet laboratory, a mixture intended to stop the clock that ended up speeding up history. One of the most stunning discoveries of the ancient world is the terracotta army, a silent stone legion that waited in darkness for over 2,000 years. It was found by accident in 1974 when local farmers in Xi'an were digging a well during a drought and struck a clay head instead of water. Beneath the soil lay an entire army, estimated to contain over 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots, and hundreds of horses. What makes this find so hypnotic is that no 2 soldiers are exactly alike. The artisans who crafted them didn't use a single mold. They modeled unique facial features, hairstyles, and expressions for every single statue, perhaps basing them on real people from the time. They were created to protect the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, in the afterlife. The scale of the emperor's tomb complex is essentially an underground city, complete with stables and offices. Ancient historical records claim that the central tomb, which has never been opened by modern archaeologists, contains rivers and oceans made of liquid mercury, flowing mechanically to simulate the world. High levels of mercury found in the soil nearby suggest this legend might actually be true. It is a place of frozen vigilance, where thousands of individual faces stare out into the earth, guarding a secret that we still haven't fully disturbed. For centuries, the production of silk was the most closely guarded industrial secret on earth. The fabric was so light, so strong, and so shimmering that the Roman Empire became obsessed with it, trading gold weight for weight to obtain it. Yet, the Romans had absolutely no idea where it came from. Some Roman scholars confidently wrote that silk grew on trees, combed from the leaves by the seers people of the East. The Chinese imperial court knew the truth, that it came from the cocoon of the mulberry silkworm, and they went to extreme lengths to protect that knowledge. Revealing the secret of sericulture to a foreigner was a crime punishable by death. Travelers were searched at the borders, and the export of silkworm eggs was strictly forbidden. This monopoly held firm for 1,000 years until, according to legend, a Chinese princess who was marrying a prince of cotton smuggled the eggs out. She couldn't bear the thought of living without her favorite fabric, so she hid the tiny eggs and mulberry seeds inside her elaborate headdress, where border guards couldn't search. The secret eventually made its way to the Byzantine Empire, supposedly carried in the hollow walking staffs of monks. It is a testament to how a single thread, spun by a small moth, could bind empires together and drive the economy of the entire ancient world. Money hasn't always been made of metal or paper. For a long time in the East, you could drink your currency. This was the era of the tea brick, a form of money that was edible, aromatic, and surprisingly durable. To create these bricks, tea leaves were ground down, mixed with binders like flour or blood, and pressed into dense, heavy blocks, sometimes embossed with patterns or values. This form of currency was used extensively across China, Tibet, Mongolia, and Siberia, up until the early 20th century. The value of the brick depended on the quality of the tea and its condition. In daily transactions, you wouldn't just hand over a coin. You might break off a scored section of the brick to make change. This currency had a distinct advantage over gold or silver. It had intrinsic biological value. If you were traveling across the harsh steppes of Siberia or the high altitudes of the Himalayas and ran out of food, you could boil your money to make a nourishing, caffeinated soup that would keep you alive. It was wealth that provided warmth. The bricks were so solid they were transported by yak and camel trains over thousands of miles without crumbling. In some remote regions, these fragrant blocks of compressed leaves were preferred over coins well into the modern era, a currency that fed the body as well as the economy. Long before the magnetic compass was used to guide ships across the ocean, it was used to guide energy across the land. The Chinese invented the compass during the Han Dynasty, but its original purpose was for geomancy or feng shui. The earliest compasses looked nothing like the ones we use today. They consisted of a spoon-shaped instrument made of lodestone, a naturally magnetized mineral resting on a smooth bronze plate called a heaven plate. The spoon would spin and settle with its handle pointing south. To the ancients, south was the primary direction of honor and warmth, unlike the north-oriented maps we use today. These devices were used to determine the luckiest orientation for a new house, the proper alignment for a temple, or the most auspicious burial site for an ancestor. The idea was to harmonize human structures with the invisible flows of energy in the earth. It wasn't until nearly 1,000 years later that someone realized this south-pointing fish could be used for navigation at sea. This transition changed the world, allowing sailors to venture far from the sight of land and under cloudy skies where stars were hidden. But it began as a tool for harmony, a way to listen to the silent magnetic whisper of the planet. Deep in the Cambodian jungle lies Angkor Wat, a temple complex of such immense scale that it remains the largest religious structure ever built. Constructed in the 12th century, it was designed to represent Mount Meru, the home of the gods in Hindu mythology. The sheer volume of stone used to build it is greater than that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. What makes this feat even more impressive is that the sandstone blocks were quarried from a holy mountain over 30 miles away. Without wheels or engines, thousands of workers floated these massive stones down a network of canals on bamboo rafts. The entire complex is surrounded by a massive moat, nearly 200 meters wide, which isn't just for defense or aesthetics. It's a brilliant piece of engineering. The water in the moat stabilizes the foundation of the temple, preventing the groundwater from rising or falling too drastically, which keeps the heavy stone structures from sinking into the soft soil. The precision of the construction is such that on the spring equinox, the sun rises exactly over the central tower. Over time, the jungle has tried to reclaim the city, with massive silk cotton trees winding their pale roots over the stone walls like spilling wax, creating a slow-motion wrestling match between human ambition and the relentless growth of nature. The invention of paper is one of those quiet revolutions that completely altered the weight of knowledge. Before paper became common, Chinese scholars wrote on strips of bamboo or wood, which were tied together into heavy, cumbersome scrolls. If you wanted to read a book, you might need a cart to transport it. Wealthy people could write on silk, but it was far too expensive for daily use. In the early 2nd century, a court official named Kai Lun revolutionized this by creating a new material. He mixed mulberry bark, hemp, old rags, and discarded fishnets into a slurry, spread it thin, and let it dry. The result was a sheet that was lightweight, flexible, and cheap to produce. This invention allowed information to travel light. A scholar could carry a library in his arms rather than on a wagon. The secret of papermaking traveled slowly along the Silk Road, famously moving west after the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, where captured Chinese papermakers taught the skill to the Arab world. From there, it eventually reached Europe, replacing the expensive animal skin parchment that had limited book production for centuries. It transformed writing from a permanent, heavy monument into something fleeting and fluid, allowing ideas to spread like seeds on the wind. In the heart of Baghdad, during the height of the Islamic Golden Age, there stood a magnificent academy known as the House of Wisdom. This wasn't merely a library, but the intellectual center of the world for centuries, where scholars from every corner of the earth gathered to translate the entirety of human knowledge into Arabic. While Europe was largely quiet, the scholars here were preserving the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen, saving them from the silence of history. The walls were lined with manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, representing a level of open inquiry that wouldn't be seen again for hundreds of years. It was here that the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra, a word derived from his book titled Al-Jabr, laying the groundwork for the calculations that run our modern world. The scale of this operation was immense. The caliphs paid the weight of each translated book in gold, creating an economy where knowledge was the most valuable currency of all. Tragically, this beacon of learning was destroyed during the Mongol siege of 1258, and legends say the Tigris River ran black with ink from the thousands of books thrown into its waters. Yet, enough knowledge had already filtered out to spark the Renaissance in Europe centuries later, a ghost of a library that, in its destruction, managed to seed the future. For most of human history, the way we sleep tonight in one long, unbroken 8-hour block was not the standard. Throughout the Middle Ages, and arguably long before, people practiced what historians now call biphasic sleep, or segmented sleep. The night was viewed as 2 distinct chapters. At sunset, families would go to bed for their first sleep, which lasted about 4 hours. Then, around midnight, the entire world would wake up. This wasn't a time of insomnia or frustration, but a peaceful, active interval of an hour or two known as the watch. In the quiet of the deep night, people would stay in bed to pray, reflect on their dreams, or talk softly with their spouses, while others might rise to tend the fire, check on farm animals, or even visit neighbors. It was a time of intimacy and calm that belonged entirely to the night. After this wakeful period, they would settle back down for their second sleep until morning. This rhythm was so natural that it is mentioned casually in literature from the time, including the Canterbury Tales, without any need for explanation. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution brought artificial light and rigid factory schedules that we compressed our rest into a single block, losing that quiet, midnight hour of wakefulness that our ancestors cherished. One of the stranger realities of the medieval legal system was that animals were considered fully accountable for their actions, just like humans. If a pig wandered into a shop and knocked over a valuable vase, or if a swarm of weevils destroyed a crop, they could be formally taken to court. These were not mock trials, but serious legal proceedings with judges, prosecutors, and even defense attorneys appointed to represent the animals. In 1457, a sow and her piglets were put on trial in France for attacking a child. The mother was found guilty, but the piglets were acquitted because their youth was considered a mitigating factor, and no one could prove they had participated willingly. In other cases, church courts would issue summons to rats or insects, ordering them to leave a village by a certain date. When the rats inevitably failed to show up, their court-appointed lawyers would argue on their behalf, claiming the cats on the road made the journey too dangerous for their clients to attend. It seems comical to us now, but it reflected a deep belief in a moral universe where every creature, no matter how small, was part of the same divine order and subject to the same laws of justice. A time when the line between human and nature was much more fluid. Long before Christopher Columbus set sail, Norse sailors had already crossed the Atlantic and established a foothold in North America. Around the year 1000 CE, the Viking explorer Leif Erikson led an expedition to a land he called Vinland, known today as Newfoundland in Canada. For centuries, this was dismissed as a mere legend from the Norse sagas, a story told around fires to entertain children. But in the 1960s, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Elance, Ox Meadows, proving the story's true. They found the foundations of turf houses identical to those in Iceland, along with iron nails and a bronze pin that could only have come from Viking hands. Perhaps most interestingly, they found butternuts in the settlement, a type of walnut that never grew in Newfoundland, meaning these explorers had ventured even further south into New Brunswick or Quebec to harvest them. The settlement was small and temporary, likely used for ship repair and wintering over a few decades. Eventually, the Norse withdrew, and the knowledge of this new continent faded back into the mists of their oral history. It remains a quiet testament to the bravery of sailors who crossed the icy, gray Atlantic in open wooden boats, touching the edge of a new world 500 years before history recorded it. The construction of a medieval cathedral was a project so vast that the people who started it knew, for a fact, they would not live to see it finished. These stone giants were multi-generational undertakings, often taking over a century to complete. The famous Cologne Cathedral in Germany was started in 1248, But work halted in 1473 and didn't resume until the 19th century, leaving it unfinished for hundreds of years, with a crane still perched atop its tower, a landmark of patience. Master masons would lay the foundations, knowing that their grandsons or great-grandsons would be the ones to place the final spire. There were no detailed blueprints as we have today. Instead, knowledge was passed down through guilds, from master to apprentice, preserving the secrets of geometry and load-bearing, stone mentally, and through practical demonstration. Every gargoyle, stained glass window, and vaulted arch was crafted by hand, often by artisans who carved their personal marks into the stone, signatures that would be hidden high in the dark rafters, seen only by God and the birds. It was an act of supreme faith and community, creating a legacy that anchored the town not just in space, but in time. A stone promise made to the future, built slowly, block by heavy block. Before the mechanical clock brought the tyranny of minutes and seconds to our lives, time was a softer, more fluid concept measured by the elements. One of the most ingenious methods used in the Middle Ages was the candle clock. Attributed in England to King Alfred the Great, these were simple yet effective devices. A candle of a specific size and wax purity was marked with lines at regular intervals. As the candle burned down, it passed these marks, counting the hours in a silent, glowing descent. A standard candle might burn for exactly 4 hours, so a king or abbot could divide their day into shifts of prayer, administration, and rest. To ensure accuracy, these candles had to be protected from drafts that would make the flame gutter and burn too quickly, leading to the invention of lanterns made with thin, scraped animal horn, the horn window, which protected the flame while letting the light shine through. This meant that time itself was tied to light and warmth. When the candle went out, the measure of time vanished into darkness. It was a way of living where time didn't tick or talk, but melted away, a gentle reminder of the physical consumption of the day. A flickering, warm companion in the stone-walled rooms of the past. Academic robes seen at modern university graduations, the long gowns, the hoods, and the flat caps, are not just ceremonial costumes, but fossilized remnants of medieval fashion. In the 12th and 13th centuries, when the first universities were forming in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, there was no central heating. Scholars and students sat in drafty, stone-cold church buildings or unheated halls for hours at a time listening to lectures. The capicola, or closed cloak, was a heavy, floor-length woolen garment worn over clothes purely to keep warm. The hood, which today hangs decoratively down the back with colorful satin linings, was originally a functional head covering that could be pulled up to protect against the bitter drafts blowing through the unglazed windows. Even the hanging sleeves had a purpose. They often functioned as pockets or sacks where a scholar could stash a loaf of bread or a book, keeping their hands free and warm inside the folds. Over centuries, as heating improved and fashion changed, these heavy, practical garments were abandoned for daily wear, but retained for official occasions, freezing a moment of medieval necessity in time. When a student walks across a stage today, they are walking in the ghostly footsteps of a scholar trying to keep from freezing in a cold stone hall. One of the most intimate glimpses we have into the mind of a genius comes from the thousands of pages of notebooks left behind by Leonardo da Vinci. What makes these journals particularly fascinating is not just the sketches of flying machines or anatomical studies, but the fact that he he wrote almost all of them in mirror script, running from right to left across the page. To read his thoughts today, you would need to hold the paper up to a mirror to decipher the Italian text. Historians have debated for centuries why he did this, suggesting everything from a desire to keep his invention secret from prying eyes to a way of preventing his hand from smudging the wet ink as he wrote, since he was left-handed. But the most likely explanation is simply that it was more comfortable for him, a natural flow for his particular neurology that he never felt the need to correct. In these notebooks, we see a mind that didn't distinguish between art and science, covering pages with observations of how water swirls in a river, how birds' wing flexes, and how light hits a curved surface. He filled over 13,000 pages with these notes, though only about 7,000 have survived to the present day. They are a testament to a specific kind of solitude, the quiet scratching of a pen late at night, recording the world not as it was taught, but as it was truly seen. A private language for a conversation with oneself. Before the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, the human memory was a far more rigorous and structured landscape than it is today. Because books were rare, hand-copied, and incredibly expensive, scholars and storytellers could not rely on looking things up. They had to carry their libraries within their own minds. To do this, they used a technique called the method of loci, or the memory palace, where they would mentally construct a complex building and place pieces of information in specific rooms or corners. A student might remember a philosophical argument by imagining a golden statue standing in the foyer of their imaginary palace, or recall a specific law by placing a red tapestry in the mental hallway. When Gutenberg's press began churning out identical pages by the thousands, this internal architecture began to crumble. We gained the ability to store humanity's knowledge on shelves and in archives, making information accessible to millions. But we lost the intense, disciplined practice of holding vast amounts of knowledge inside us. The printing press didn't just change how we read. It fundamentally altered the structure of human thought, moving our collective memory from the neurons of the brain to the ink on the page. We traded the internal fortress of memory for the external ocean of information. During the first circumnavigation of the globe, the crew of Ferdinand Magellan stumbled upon a phenomenon that seemed to defy the basic logic of time itself. The expedition left Spain in 1519 and sailed west, chasing the sunset across the Atlantic, round the tip of South America, and across the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. For 3 years, the ship's chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, kept a meticulous daily log, marking down every sunrise and sunset with absolute precision to ensure the crew observed religious holy days correctly. Yet, when the battered remnants of the fleet finally arrived in Cape Verde on their way home, they were confused to find that the locals said it was Thursday, while Pigafetta's log insisted it was Wednesday. The crew was terrified, fearing they had accidentally fasted on the wrong days or celebrated Sundays on a Monday, endangering their souls. They hadn't made a mistake in their counting. They had simply discovered the reality of a round planet. By sailing west against the rotation of the Earth, they had traveled with the sun, effectively lengthening each day by a tiny fraction. Over the course of 3 years, those fractions added up to exactly one full rotation, one full day that had vanished into the ether. It was the first physical proof that time is relative to where you stand, and how you move. A day lost to the horizon, never to be found again. In the Dutch Golden Age, the quiet rationality of the merchant class was temporarily suspended by a collective obsession with a simple flower, the tulip. During the height of tulip mania in the 1630s, the price of a single bulb could exceed the cost of a luxurious house on the finest canal in Amsterdam. The most coveted flowers were not solid in color, but possessed intricate, flame-like streaks of white or yellow against red or purple petals. A pattern we now know was caused by a mosaic virus infecting the plant. At the time, however, it seemed like a miracle of nature, and people became intoxicated by the beauty and the potential for wealth. Contracts for bulbs were traded in the back rooms of taverns, changing hands dozens of times a day, with people selling their land, their livestock, and their life savings to buy a root that was still buried underground. It was a strange moment where the value of an object detached completely from its utility, driven purely by the belief that someone else would pay more tomorrow. When the market inevitably crashed in February 1637, the imaginary wealth evaporated overnight, leaving people with nothing but ordinary flowers. It remains a fascinating reminder of how easily value can be constructed and how quickly it can dissolve. A fever dream of color that faded with the season. Fork, a utensil that seems so fundamental to modern dining, was once considered a scandalous and even heretical innovation in Europe. For centuries, people ate with their fingers, using stale bread as a plate or sharing soup from a communal bowl, a practice that emphasized the shared, communal nature of the meal. When the fork was introduced to Italy in the 11th century by a Byzantine princess, it was met with shock and ridicule by the religious authorities. Clergy preached that God had provided humans with natural forks, our fingers, and that using an artificial metal prong to convey food to the mouth was an insult to divine creation. It was seen as an affectation of extreme vanity and excessive delicacy. Even as late as the 16th century, when Catherine de' Medici brought forks to the French court, they were mocked as effeminate tools that made eating unnecessarily complicated. It took centuries for the utensil to move from a symbol of sin and pretension to a standard tool of daily life. The transition marks a shift in how we view our bodies and our food, moving from a tactile, direct connection to what we eat toward a more detached and sanitized experience. A slow evolution of manners, one prong at a time. It is difficult to speak a single sentence in modern English without using a word invented or popularized by William Shakespeare. The bard didn't just write plays, he acted as an engineer of the language itself, introducing roughly 1,700 words that had never been written down before. Before him, the English language was more rigid and limited, often lacking the vocabulary to describe complex emotional states or specific textures of reality. He filled these gaps by turning nouns into verbs, combining words, or simply making them up entirely. Words like lonely, kiss, addiction, gloomy, bedroom, and fashionable all appear in his texts, often for the first time. He gave us the language to describe the silence of a hush, the brightness of radiance, and the feeling of being jaded. It's staggering to think that before these plays were performed, English speakers didn't have a specific, common word for the feeling of being lonely, or at least, not one that survived. He crafted these sounds to fit the rhythm of his iambic pentameter, and in doing so, He permanently expanded the boundaries of how we can articulate our own lives. We speak his thoughts every day, often without knowing it, using the tools he carved out of ink and air 400 years ago. Words that were once strange and new, now worn smooth by centuries of use. Maps from the age of exploration are famous for what they show, but they are perhaps most beautiful for what they admit they do not know. In the vast, empty stretches of the oceans or the unexplored interiors of continents, cartographers would not leave the parchment blank. Instead, they filled these voids with illustrations of sea monsters, dragons, and ships engaged in battle. The Latin phrase terra incognita, or unknown land, was often inscribed over these regions, turning ignorance into a place of mystery rather than emptiness. These maps were not just navigational tools, they were psychological landscapes that balanced scientific discovery with human imagination. The monsters weren't necessarily believed to be literal by every sailor, but they represented the very real danger and fear of the unknown. As explorers sailed further and charted more coastlines, the dragons and monsters slowly retreated from the maps, replaced by the hard lines of surveyed shores and named cities. The world became more known, more measured, and more predictable. There's a certain melancholy in watching the unknown land shrink on these old documents, as the room for mystery was slowly traded for the certainty of coordinates. A world once filled with dragons, now fully measured and known. High heels were originally designed for Persian warriors fighting on horseback, not for walking on city streets. It begins in the 10th century, where the heel was a critical piece of military technology rather than a fashion statement. When a soldier stood up in his stirrups to shoot an arrow while riding, he needed something to lock his boot in place so he wouldn't slip. A blocky heel carved into the sole of the boot provided exactly that stability, allowing for deadly accuracy at high speeds. When the Persian Shah visited Europe in 1599, European aristocrats were fascinated by his footwear and immediately adopted the style to give themselves a taller, more masculine, and military appearance. For over a century, high heels were worn primarily by men who wanted to project power and status. King Louis XIV of France even instituted a rule that only members of his court could wear heels colored red, creating a literal visual separation between the classes. It wasn't until the mid-17th century that women began adopting the style, and men slowly abandoned it to distance themselves from what was becoming a feminine trend. By the time the French Revolution arrived, high heels had largely disappeared for men, leaving behind their equestrian origins for a new life in the ballrooms and sidewalks of the modern world. A tool of war that transformed into a symbol of grace. There was a time when a simple shaker of salt on a dining table represented a fortune. This common mineral, now one of the cheapest items in any grocery store, was once the cornerstone of economies and a primary reason for trade routes like the Via Salaria in Italy. The value of salt didn't come from its flavor, but from its unique ability to preserve life. Before refrigeration, salting meat and fish was the only way to ensure a population could survive the winter without starving. It was a matter of national security, so vital that Roman soldiers were occasionally paid an allowance, specifically to purchase it, a payment known as a salarium, which is the origin of our modern word salary. In many cultures, offering bread and salt to guests was the highest form of hospitality, a promise of safety and shared wealth. Governments held strict monopolies on salt production, and the high taxes placed on it sparked riots and revolutions from France to India. Wars were fought to control salt mines, and cities were built where the mineral could be found. It is strange to think that the white grains we casually brush off a tablecloth were once weighed against gold, a substance that determined whether a civilization would endure the winter or fade away. A white mineral that once moved empires now sits unnoticed. In the dining halls of 18th century Europe, the ultimate status symbol was a fruit that most people didn't even eat. The pineapple was so rare and difficult to grow in the cold European climate that owning one was equivalent to owning a luxury sports car today. To produce a single pineapple in England or France, gardeners had to construct elaborate hothouses called pineries, which used stove systems to mimic the tropical heat of the Caribbean. The cost of labor, coal, and time meant that a single fruit could cost the equivalent of $8,000 in modern currency. Because they were so valuable, eating them was often considered a waste. Instead, the pineapple was used as a centerpiece at dinner parties to demonstrate the host's immense wealth and reach. For those who couldn't afford to grow their own, a rental market emerged where a person could pay to borrow a pineapple for one night, carry it around a party to show it off, and then return it the next day so it could be rented to someone else. This obsession is why you still see stone pineapples carved into the gateposts of old manor houses and public buildings. It was an enduring sign of hospitality and prestige, a luxury that became a grocery store staple. Before the constant hum of the electric refrigerator changed our lives, summer ice was a miracle harvested from the frozen lakes of winter. In the 19th century, a massive global industry revolved around the dangerous work of cutting ice from lakes in places like New England and Norway. Men and horses would venture out onto the frozen water, using massive saws to carve out distinct blocks that were then floated to shore and stored in double-walled ice houses insulated with sawdust and hay. The Ice King, Frederick Tudor, revolutionized this trade by discovering that with enough sawdust insulation, he could ship this winter ice to the hottest places on Earth without it melting entirely. Ships loaded with blocks of frozen Massachusetts water traveled all the way to India, the Caribbean, and South America, arriving months later with more than half their cargo still intact. For the first time in history, someone in the sweltering heat of Havana or Calcutta could enjoy a cold drink in the middle of July. It was a luxury that felt like magic, transforming food preservation and medicine. The industry employed nearly 100,000 people, a bustling trade of cold and crystal that vanished almost instantly when electric freezing became possible, leaving behind only the ghost of a winter harvest, a ghost industry that melted away. For centuries, capturing the intense blue of the sky was the most expensive challenge in the art world. The pigment known as ultramarine was worth more than its weight in gold, crafted from a semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli. For most of history, the only known source of this stone was a single region in the Sarai Sang mines of Afghanistan. Stone had to be mined, carried on donkeys through dangerous mountain passes, and then shipped across the sea to Venice, hence the name ultramarine, which literally means beyond the sea. Once it arrived, artists had to grind the stone by hand and separate the blue particles from the impurities in a long, difficult process. Because of its astronomical cost, the color was reserved for the most important subjects, most notably the robes of the Virgin Mary in religious paintings. Clients would often specify in contracts exactly how much ultramarine the painter was allowed to use. And if a patron didn't pay for the high-grade pigment, the sky in the painting would be painted with cheaper, unstable blues that turned gray or green over time. It wasn't until a French chemist invented a synthetic version in 1826 that the color blue became affordable for everyone, democratizing the color of the heavens for the first time. The color of the sky was once the hardest thing to capture on Earth. Bathing in the ancient world was rarely a private act. It was a loud, bustling center of social life that functioned more like a community center than a bathroom. In the Roman Empire, the bathhouses, or thermae, were massive complexes that included gyms, libraries, gardens, and food stalls. People of all classes would come not just to wash, but to gossip, conduct business, and relax for hours. The engineering behind these baths was sophisticated, utilizing a hypocaust system where furnaces heated air that circulated under raised floors and through hollow walls, keeping the rooms and water at precise temperatures. A bather would move through a specific sequence, from the cold frigidarium to the warm tepidarium, and finally to the hot caldarium. Instead of soap, they used olive oil, which they rubbed into their skin and then scraped off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing dirt and sweat in the process. The environment was far from the quiet spa atmosphere we imagine today. The philosopher Seneca once lived above a bathhouse and complained about the noise, the grunting of weightlifters, the splash of divers, the calls of sausage sellers, and the constant chatter of hundreds of people. It was a place where the barriers of the city dissolved in the steam. A shared intimacy we've replaced with private porcelain. The past sounded fundamentally different, defined by a depth of silence we can no longer access in the modern world. Before the Industrial Revolution, the acoustic landscape was not dominated by the background hum that blankets us today, the sound of distant traffic, air conditioning units, computer fans, and airplane engines. This constant low-frequency noise has shrunk our acoustic horizon, the distance at which we can hear a clear sound. In the past, the world was quieter, which meant that individual sounds traveled much further and carried more meaning. A church bell ringing in a village could be heard by farmers working miles away in the fields, regulating the time for an entire region. The sound of a wagon wheel on cobblestones or a blacksmith's hammer would stand out sharply against the silence. But this quiet also meant that loud sounds were truly terrifying. The crack of thunder or the roar of a cannon was an overwhelming sensory experience that we can scarcely imagine today. Nighttime was especially profound, a heavy blanket of silence where the only sounds were the wind, animals, and the settling of wood. We have gained the ability to communicate across the world, but we have lost the ability to hear the world itself in its natural state. A silence we can no longer find. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a city when the people have gone. It is not an empty silence, but a waiting one, where the buildings and streets hold onto the memory of the lives once lived there. In the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, that memory was preserved in a single, terrifying instant in the autumn of 79 CE. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it didn't just destroy the city, it encased it. A thick blanket of volcanic ash and pumice, reaching heights of up to 6 meters, buried everything so quickly and completely that the air itself was sealed out. For nearly 1,700 years, the city slept beneath the earth, forgotten by the changing world above. This ash acted as a perfect preservative, freezing time in a way that no other historical record has ever managed. When excavators finally began to dig in the 18th century, they found fruit still in glass bowls and loaves of bread still inside the ovens, marked with the baker's stamp, waiting to be retrieved for a lunch that never came. The ash had hardened around the victims, and as their organic matter decayed over centuries, it left behind hollow voids in the rock. Archaeologists realized they could pour liquid plaster into these spaces, creating perfect statues of the people in their final moments sleeping, holding one another, or covering their faces. We know their hairstyles, their clothing, and even the expressions they wore. It is a ghost story told not in words, but in stone, offering us a glimpse of a Tuesday morning that has lasted for 2,000 years. A city stopped in mid-breath, waiting for the dust to settle. For centuries, the city of Thonis Heracleion was thought to be nothing more than a legend, a myth mentioned in passing by Greek historians like Herodotus. It was said to be the gateway to Egypt, a port of immense wealth and religious significance, where new pharaohs would travel to receive their power from the gods. But as time passed, no trace of it could be found, and it faded into the realm of fable. Then, in the year 2000, a French underwater archaeologist named Frank Gaudio discovered something remarkable in the murky waters of Abu Qir Bay, near Alexandria. Buried under centuries of sand and silt, sitting quietly on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, were the colossal statues of the lost city. It hadn't been destroyed by war, but by the earth itself, a process called soil liquefaction, likely triggered by earthquakes or floods, caused the ground beneath the heavy temples to turn to liquid, sliding the entire city into the sea around the 8th century CE. Divers found massive statues of gods and kings, over 5 meters tall, looking up through the water with calm, eroded faces. They found 64 ancient shipwrecks, gold coins, and giant stone tablets inscribed with hieroglyphs, all perfectly preserved by the lack of oxygen in the underwater mud. It is a city that drowns slowly, taking its treasures with it into the deep. Today, fish swim through the temple gates where priests once walked, and the silence of the ocean protects the history that the land could not hold. A submerged kingdom where the only visitors are the currents and the light filtering down from above. High in the arid plains of southern Peru, there is a gallery of art intended only for the sky. The Nazca lines are a collection of enormous geoglyphs, drawings made on the ground, etched into the desert floor between 500 BCE and 500 CE. These aren't small sketches, they are massive designs, some stretching over 300 meters across, depicting hummingbirds, monkeys, spiders, and vast geometric shapes that run straight for kilometers. The method of their creation was surprisingly simple, yet required immense planning. The desert floor is covered in reddish-brown iron oxide pebbles, but underneath lies a layer of pale, lime-rich soil. By carefully removing the top layer of dark stones to reveal the white ground beneath, the Nazca people created high-contrast lines that have survived for 2,000 years. They endure because of the unique climate of the region. It is one of the driest places on Earth, with almost no wind and very little rain to wash the designs away. The mystery, of course, is why they were made. From the ground, the lines just look like shallow trenches or paths. Their true shapes can only be fully appreciated from hundreds of meters in the air, a perspective the Nazca people could never have achieved. Theories stories range from astronomical calendars and water rituals to walking paths for ceremonial processions. Some believe they were messages to the gods, prayers written in a font large enough for the heavens to read. They remain there today, ancient scratches on the planet's surface, a silent communication between the earth and the empty blue sky. Hidden deep within the cloud forests of the Andes Mountains sits a city that the Spanish conquistadors never found. Machu Picchu is often called the lost city of the Incas, though it was never truly lost to the locals living in the valley below. It was only hidden from the outside world until Hiram Bingham arrived in 1911. Built around 1450 for the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, the citadel sits on a narrow ridge between two mountain peaks, often shrouded in heavy mists that drift up from the Urubamba River far below. What makes Machu Picchu a marvel of engineering is how it integrates with the perilous landscape. The Incas built it without the use of wheels, iron tools, or mortar. The stones were cut so precisely that not even a knife blade can fit between them, a technique called ashlar masonry. This wasn't just for aesthetics, it was for survival. Peru is seismically unstable, and rigid mortar would crack during an earthquake. Instead, the dry stone walls of Machu Picchu move slightly during tremors, and then settle back into place, dancing with the earth rather than fighting it. The city is also surrounded by hundreds of agricultural terraces that prevented the mountain from sliding away during heavy rains while providing food for the population. It was abandoned just a century after its construction, likely due to smallpox spreading ahead of the Spanish invaders. For centuries, the jungle reclaimed the stone, wrapping vines around the temples and hiding the terraces in green, keeping the sanctuary safe in its cradle of clouds. A secret garden of stone suspended in the sky. Long before the pyramids of Giza or the stone circles of Stonehenge were even a thought, a group of hunter-gatherers in what is now Turkey came together to build something impossible. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest known temple in the world, dating back nearly 12,000 years. This site challenges everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. The conventional timeline suggested that humans first developed agriculture, then settled in villages, and only then had the resources and organization to build complex temples. But Göbekli Tepe flips that narrative upside down. Here, nomadic people with no metal tools and no permanent homes carved massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 10 tons, and arranged them in circles. These pillars are decorated with intricate reliefs of scorpions, lions, snakes, and vultures, carved with a skill that suggests a long tradition of artistry we have yet to discover. The sheer effort to quarry, move, and erect these stones without wheels or beasts of burden is staggering. It suggests that the urge to worship and gather for sacred rituals came before the invention of farming, that religion might have been the spark that caused civilization to form, rather than a product of it. Even more mysterious is how the site ended. Around 8000 BCE, the people didn't just abandon the temple, they intentionally buried it under tons of earth and debris, sealing it away. It lay hidden in a man-made hill for thousands of years, a time capsule left by our ancestors at the very dawn of history. A cathedral built by people who had not yet invented the house. For over 1,000 years, the history of ancient Egypt was a locked room. We could see the statues, the temples, and the millions of hieroglyphs carved into every surface, but the ability to read them had vanished with the fall of the Roman Empire. The ancient voice was silent, the symbols merely decoration to the untrained eye. That silence broke in 1799 near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta. French soldiers reinforcing a fort stumbled upon a broken slab of dark granodiorite that would change history. The Rosetta Stone wasn't a poetic masterpiece or a book of secrets. It was a relatively mundane government decree issued in 196 BCE by King Ptolemy V. However, its value lay in its redundancy. The same message was carved into the stone 3 times in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphic, the language of the gods; demotic, the language of the people; and ancient Greek, the language of the administration. Because scholars could still read ancient Greek, they had the key to the cipher. It took decades of obsessive work, primarily by a young French scholar named Jean-François Champollion, to crack the code. He realized that the hieroglyphs weren't just symbolic pictures, but also represented sounds, a phonetic alphabet intertwined with art. When he finally succeeded in 1822, the mute monuments of Egypt began to speak again. Suddenly, we knew the names of the pharaohs, their prayers, their wars, and their love stories. A single broken rock had turned the lights back on in a room that had been dark for a millennium. On the coast of what is now North Carolina, there's a mystery that has puzzled historians for over 400 years. In 1587, a group of about 115 English settlers established a colony on Roanoke Island, attempting to build a permanent life in the New World. Their leader, John White, sailed back to England to gather more supplies, intending to return within a few months. But war with Spain delayed him, and he was unable to return for 3 long years. When he finally set foot on Roanoke Island again in 1590, the colony was gone. The houses had been dismantled, not destroyed, suggesting an orderly departure rather than a sudden attack. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, and no graves. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a wooden post of the palisade: Croatoan, and the letters CRO carved into a nearby tree. It was the name of a nearby island and a friendly Native American tribe, suggesting the settlers might have moved there for safety. But a storm prevented White from searching the nearby island, and he was forced to return to England without answers. Did they assimilate with the local tribes? Did they try to sail home and perish at sea? Did they fall victim to disease or drought? Despite centuries of searching, archaeology, and DNA testing, no definitive trace of the lost colony has ever been confirmed. They simply stepped off the edge of history and into the forest, leaving behind only a name carved in wood. A community that vanished like a mist in the morning sun. For most of human history, a moment could only be preserved in memory or interpreted through the stroke of a painter's brush. But that changed in a quiet French workroom in the 1820s. The very first photograph ever taken still exists today, a ghostly and grainy image known as View from the Window at Le Gras. It was created by Joseph Nicephore Niepce, an inventor who coated a pewter plate with a substance called bitumen of Judea, a naturally occurring asphalt that hardens when exposed to light. He placed the plate inside a camera obscura and set it in his upstairs window, pointing it toward the courtyard and the outbuildings of his estate. Unlike the instantaneous snapshots we take with our phones today, this image required an immense amount of patience. The exposure time was so long estimated to be at least 8 hours, and possibly several days, that the sun had time to travel across the entire sky. If you look closely at the surviving image, you can see sunlight illuminating both the left and the right sides of the buildings simultaneously, a physical impossibility that reveals the passage of time captured in a single frame. The result was not a sharp picture, but a hazy, dreamlike impression of reality, fixed forever on metal. Napes called his process heliography, or sunwriting. It was the first time the world had been allowed to draw itself, trapping a fleeting summer day in a layer of hardened asphalt. A moment of silence that has lasted for nearly 2 centuries. Before the mid-19th century, time was a purely local concept, dictated by the position of the sun over a specific town square rather than a synchronized global clock. If it was noon in London, it might be 12:10 in Norwich and 11:50 in Bristol. And for thousands of years, these small differences didn't matter at all. Life moved at the speed of a walking horse or a drifting boat, and a few minutes of difference between cities had no impact on the rhythm of the day. But the arrival of the steam train changed the nature of time itself. As trains began to tear across the countryside at unprecedented speeds, the patchwork of local times became a dangerous and confusing hazard. A train leaving London at a specific hour could arrive in a different city before it had technically left, or miss a connection because the station clocks disagreed. To solve this, the Great Western Railway in England introduced a standardized railway time in 1840, forcing station masters to align their clocks with Greenwich Mean Time. It was a profound psychological shift for humanity. For the first time, people began to live by a mechanical, abstract grid of hours rather than the natural arc of the sun. Slowly, town by town, the public clocks were adjusted, sometimes by minute hands made of copper or iron, pulling the entire world into a single, synchronized rhythm. We stopped looking up at the sky to know the time and started looking at the wall. In the sweltering summer of 1858, the city of London was brought to standstill by an event known historically as the Great Stink. For centuries, the River Thames had served as both the primary water source and the main sewer for the growing metropolis, a balance that finally collapsed under the weight of the industrial population. Heat that summer was oppressive, baking the river and its contents until the smell became so overwhelming that it physically affected the workings of the British government. In the Houses of Parliament, located right on the riverbank, curtains were soaked in chloride of lime in a desperate attempt to mask the odor. But it wasn't enough. Lawmakers were frequently forced to flee the building with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. This crisis forced a realization that the city needed a new circulatory system, leading to one of the greatest engineering feats of the Victorian age. An engineer named Joseph Bazalgette designed a massive network of intercepting sewers, huge underground brick cathedrals that would divert waste away from the river. These tunnels were constructed with such precision and durability that many are still in use today, hidden beneath the modern streets. Bazalgette's work involved using 318 million bricks and excavating 3.5 million cubic yards of earth, effectively building a new city beneath the old one. It was a project born from a summer of discomfort that ended up saving countless lives from cholera, turning the river from a source of sickness back into a flowing artery of the city. The Victorian era also saw the world shrink dramatically with the invention of the electric telegraph, a system that wove continents together with copper wire. Before this, the fastest a message could travel was the speed of a ship, meaning news from Europe took weeks to reach America. The dream of a transatlantic cable was dismissed by many as impossible, requiring a wire to be laid across thousands of miles of the unknown, mountainous ocean floor. The first attempts were heartbreaking failures. The cables snapped under their own weight or were lost in the deep, silent pressures of the Atlantic. In 1858, two ships, the Agamemnon and the Niagara, met in the middle of the ocean to splice their cable ends together and sail in opposite directions, paying out the wire as they went. When they finally succeeded, the first message sent by Queen Victoria to President James Buchanan took over 17 hours to transmit, a slow staccato of Morse code that nevertheless felt like a miracle. Although that first cable failed after a few weeks, the barrier had been broken. By 1866, a durable connection was established, and suddenly, the Victorian Internet was alive. Merchants, governments, and lovers could communicate across the abyss of the ocean in minutes. It was the first time in history that human thought could outpace the sun, traveling through the cold dark of the deep sea to appear as a series of clicks on a warm desk thousands of miles away. In the rigid social atmosphere of the 19th century, where expressing deep emotion was often seen as improper, people turned to the silent and subtle language of flowers to say what could not be spoken. Known as floriography, this coded communication became a complex obsession in Victorian England and America. Nearly every flower, herb, and tree had a specific meaning attached to it, derived from mythology, literature, or the plant's physical characteristics. Red rose symbolized romantic love, as it does today, but a yellow rose could mean infidelity or a decrease in love, depending on the specific dictionary used. A gift of sweet basil might indicate good wishes to some, but hatred to others. The nuance went even deeper than the type of flower. The way it was presented changed the message entirely. If a suitor offered a flower with his right hand, the answer was yes, but if he used his left hand, it was no. Flower presented upside down meant the opposite of its traditional meaning. People sent intricate small bouquets, called tussimusses, wrapped in lace doilies, which the recipient would have to decode like a secret puzzle. A simple bundle of greenery could carry a stinging rejection or a confession of burning passion, all without a single word being written or whispered. It was a way to navigate the strict rules of society, allowing feelings to bloom quietly in vases and buttonholes, hiding in plain sight. The banishment of true darkness began with the commercialization of the electric light bulb, an invention that fundamentally changed the human relationship with sleep and the night. Before the light bulb, evening activities were limited by the dim, flickering, and smelly glow of gas lamps or candles, which cast long shadows and consumed oxygen in the room. While Thomas Edison is often credited, the light bulb was the result of many inventors, including Joseph Swan, refining the idea of passing electricity through a filament in a vacuum. The early bulbs didn't have the harsh, white glare of modern LEDs. They emitted a soft, warm orange glow from carbon filaments, a light that resembled the embers of a fire more than the sun. When these bulbs first began to appear in homes and streets, people described the experience as magical, a steady, flameless light that could be summoned with a switch. It extended the day, creating a second shift where work and leisure could continue long after sunset. However, it also severed our biological link to the solar cycle. For eons, human biology had regulated sleep based on the setting sun. But now, we could create our own noon at midnight. The filament bulb was a captured star in a glass cage, pushing back the ancient fears of the dark and changing the rhythm of human rest forever. A small, glowing loop of carbon that redefined the boundaries of the day. One of the most recognizable structures in the world, the Eiffel Tower, was originally intended to be a temporary exhibit that many Parisians despised. Built for the 1889 World's Fair to celebrate the centennial of the French Revolution, Gustave Eiffel's design was a radical departure from the stone architecture of the time. It was a lattice of wrought iron, open to the wind and sky, rising 300 meters into the air. During its construction, a group of prominent artists and writers signed a petition protesting against the useless and monstrous tower, calling it a hateful column of bolted sheet metal that would humiliate the beauty of Paris. They feared it would overshadow the classic monuments like Notre Dame and the Louvre. The tower was only meant to stand for 20 years before being dismantled and sold for scrap. However, Gustave Eiffel was a clever engineer who wanted to save his creation. He encouraged the use of the tower for scientific experiments, particularly in meteorology and, crucially, wireless telegraphy. When the 20-year permit expired in 1909, the tower proved too valuable as a giant radio antenna to tear down. It had become a strategic asset for communication. Today, the Iron Lady is painted in 3 slightly different shades of bronze, darkest at the bottom and lightest at the top, to counteract atmospheric haze and ensure it looks uniform to the human eye. What was once a temporary display of industrial might become a permanent guardian of the skyline, anchored in iron and air. The first powered flight in human history covered a distance shorter than the wingspan of a modern jumbo jet. On a cold, windy morning in December 1903, on the sandy dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville and Wilbur Wright changed the world with a machine made of spruce wood and muslin fabric. The flight lasted only 12 seconds and covered just 120 feet, a distance you could walk in less than a minute. Put that in perspective, a Boeing 747 has a wingspan of about 210 feet, meaning the entire first journey of aviation could have happened comfortably on the wing of a modern airliner. The brothers had tossed a coin to see who would pilot the flyer first, and Orville won the chance to lay on his stomach in the cradle of the lower wing. When the engine roared to life, it wasn't a smooth ascent into the clouds, but a shaky, violent struggle against gravity. They were flying just a few feet above the ground, battling gusty winds that threatened to flip the fragile craft over at any moment. At the time, few people believed it had even happened, and it took years for the world to understand that the sky was no longer out of reach. It is a reminder that the biggest changes in history often start with the smallest, most uncertain steps. A brief hop over the sand that eventually lifted humanity to the stars. The computer that guided the Apollo 11 astronauts to the moon had less processing power than a singing greeting card you might buy today. The Apollo guidance computer was a marvel of engineering for its time, but by modern standards, it was incredibly basic. It had about 72 kilobytes of read-only memory and roughly 4 kilobytes of random access memory, millions of times less than the smartphone currently resting on your nightstand or in your pocket. What makes this even more fascinating is how the software was physically built. The memory wasn't stored on silicon chips as we know them now, but was woven by hand using copper wires and magnetic rings. This technique was called core rope memory, and it was so intricate that the women who wove the software were nicknamed LOLs, or little old ladies, though many were actually skilled textile workers and engineers. They had to thread wires through or around tiny ring-shaped magnets to represent the ones and zeros of binary code. If a wire went through the core, it was a 1. If it went around, it was a 0. A single misplaced wire could have jeopardized the entire mission. The astronauts relied on this handmade computer to navigate the vacuum of space, calculate re-entry angles, and land safely on the lunar surface. It suggests that while technology helps us achieve the impossible, it is human skill and courage that truly bridges the gap. For a brief period in history, the sound of the world connecting was a specific, screeching melody of static and beeps. If you were online in the 1990s, you remember the handshake of a dial-up modem. This sound, which lasted about 20 to 30 seconds, was actually a conversation between two computers trying to agree on a language. It began with a dial tone, followed by the rapid-fire clicking of phone numbers being dialed, and then a series of hisses, screeches, and static bursts. These noises were the audible evidence of data being converted into sound waves to travel over copper telephone lines, technology that was originally designed only for the human voice. The modem was testing the quality of the phone line, checking for static or interference, and deciding how fast it could send information without making mistakes. It was a chaotic, abrasive noise, yet for millions of people, it became a sound of anticipation. It meant you were about to enter a new digital library, send a message across the ocean, or explore a website, provided no one in your house picked up the landline phone and broke the connection. That sound is now extinct, replaced by silent, always-on fiber optics and Wi-Fi signals that fill the air around us. It was a noisy, clumsy overture to the digital age, singing the song of a world waking up to a new way of being. Deep in the North Atlantic, nearly 2.5 miles down, the swimming pool on the Titanic is still full of water. It is a strange and ironic fact to consider, but structurally, the pool is one of the best preserved interior spaces within the wreck. Located on F deck, the swimming bath was a luxurious novelty when the ship launched, filled with heated seawater for the enjoyment of first-class passengers. Today, it sits in absolute darkness, under crushing pressure that is hundreds of times greater than the atmosphere at sea level. While the wooden structures and fabrics of the ship have largely been devoured by metal-eating bacteria, the ceramic tiles of the pool have proven resilient. If you were to shine a light into that room today, you might see the linoleum floor and the tiled walls standing much as they did in 1912. Only now the water inside isn't drawn from a pump, but is the ocean itself. The room is eternally filled, holding the same water as the sea outside it in a perfect, silent equilibrium. It serves as a haunting capsule of leisure frozen in time, where a space built for relaxation and play has become a permanent, dark reservoir at the bottom of the world. A luxury meant for a fleeting voyage, now held in eternal suspension in the deep. The Berlin Wall, which divided a city and a world for nearly 30 years, didn't fall because of a military strike or a planned demolition, but because of a mistake at a press conference. On the evening of November 9, 1989, A fatigued government official named Gunter Schabowski was reading a new set of travel regulations for East Germany. He hadn't been fully briefed on the details, so when a journalist asked him when these new rules, which allowed travel across the border, would take effect, he hesitated. Looking at his notes, he shrugged and said, "As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay." He was supposed to say tomorrow to give the border guards time to prepare. Instead, thousands of East Berliners heard the news on television and immediately flocked to the wall. Guards, outnumbered and without orders to shoot or open the gates, were overwhelmed by the peaceful but insistent crowd. Confused and not wanting to start a massacre, the chief officer at the Bornholmer Strasse crossing finally gave the order to open the barriers. Tens of thousands of people poured through, crying, cheering, and embracing strangers on the other side. Within hours, people were climbing on top of the concrete barrier with hammers and chisels, physically taking apart the symbol of their separation. A barrier built by fear and maintained by force was dismantled by a simple human error and the weight of hope. One of the most important medical discoveries in history happened because a scientist was a bit untidy and left a window open. In 1928, Alexander Fleming was researching Staphylococcus bacteria at St. Mary's Hospital in London. He was known for having a cluttered laboratory, often leaving petri dishes stacked up for weeks. Before heading off on a 2-week vacation with his family, he left several cultures of bacteria sitting out on a bench in the corner of his lab. When he returned, he began sorting through the dishes to clean them. He noticed that one dish had been contaminated by a blue-green mold, likely spores that had drifted in through an open window or up from the floor below. But what caught his eye was that the bacteria surrounding the mold had died. There was a clear halo around the fuzzy patch where the Staphylococcus couldn't grow. Fleming realized the mold was releasing a substance that killed the bacteria, a substance he eventually named penicillin. If he had been more organized, or if he had washed his dishes immediately, he might have washed away the cure for infections that had plagued humanity for thousands of years. It took years more to turn that mold juice into a medicine, but the initial spark was pure chance. A quiet reminder that sometimes the answers we need most arrive when we aren't looking for them. The very first email ever sent has been forgotten, even by the man who sent it. In 1971, a computer engineer named Ray Tomlinson was working on a way for users to send messages between different computers. At the time, you could only leave messages for people who used the same machine as you, essentially like leaving a digital sticky note on a shared desktop. Tomlinson was working with 2 massive computers called PDP-10s that were sitting right next to each other in his lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He wrote a program to transfer the message from one to the other and needed a way to separate the user's name from the name of the computer they were on. He looked down at his keyboard and chose the @ symbol because it made sense. The person was at that specific computer, and it was a key that hardly anyone used for anything else. When he successfully sent the first message across the room, he didn't write anything profound like "What hath God wrought?" or "one small step." According to Tomlinson, the message was likely something like QWERTYOP or testing 1 2 3. He didn't save it, and he didn't write it down because he didn't realize he was inventing a system that would one day carry billions of conversations around the globe. The medium that changed how the world communicates began with a string of nonsense letters sent across 10 feet of cable. A message lost to history that changed how history is written. we look up at the night sky, we are never seeing the universe as it is right now. We are only ever seeing it as it was in the past. This is because light, despite being the fastest thing in the universe, still needs time to travel across the vast distances of space. When you look at the moon, you are seeing it as it was about 1.5 seconds ago. When you look at the sun, you are seeing it as it was 8 minutes ago. If the sun were to suddenly vanish, we wouldn't know about it for 8 whole minutes. But the further out you look, the deeper into history you travel. The bright star Sirius is seen as it was 8 years ago. The Andromeda Galaxy, the nearest major galaxy to our own, appears to us as it was 2.5 million years ago. That light left its source before modern humans even walked the earth, traveling through the emptiness while civilizations rose and fell, only to arrive at your eye tonight. It means the night sky is not a ceiling, but a library of ancient history. We are surrounded by ghosts of light, witnessing events that have already concluded long before we were born. The sky is a map of what has been. It is a strange and quiet realization that even right here on Earth, you never actually experience the present moment. Due to the way our biology works, we are always living slightly in the past. It takes time for signals to travel from your eyes, ears, and skin to your brain. And it takes a tiny bit more time for your brain to process those signals into a coherent picture of reality. Neuroscientists estimate this delay is roughly 80 milliseconds, about the blink of an eye. Everything you see, hear, or touch has already happened by the time you perceive it. When you stub your toe, the pain signal has to travel up your leg to your spine and brain before you feel it. Your brain essentially edits your experience of reality to make it feel instantaneous, synchronizing the sound of a clapping hand with the visual of the hands touching, even though the light arrives faster than the sound. We are perpetually lagging behind reality, trapped in a seamless memory of a moment that has just slipped away. We live our entire lives in the echo of the now. Before the invention of writing, human history was preserved in a much more fragile vessel, the human voice. One of the most remarkable examples of this comes from the Aboriginal people of Australia, whose oral traditions are considered the oldest in the world. Stories passed down through hundreds of generations describe a time when the geography of the continent was completely different. For example, some traditions tell of the Great Barrier Reef as a dry, open plain where people could hunt and walk, and they describe coastlines that extended much further out into the ocean. Geologists and researchers have confirmed that these stories match the landscape of Australia during the last ice age, over 10,000 years ago, before rising sea levels flooded those plains. This means that parents told their children about the changing world, and those children told their children, maintaining the core truth of the landscape for thousands of years without a single written word. It challenges our assumption that memory fades quickly without books. These stories are not just myths, they are precise navigational charts from deep time, carried on the breath of ancestors. A map drawn in the air that never washed away. High in the White Mountains of California, there lives a tree that was already ancient when the Roman Empire fell. The Great Basin bristlecone pine is one of the oldest living organisms on Earth, with some individual trees dating back over 4,800 years. One famous tree, known as Methuselah, began its life roughly around the time the ancient Egyptians were building the pyramids. These trees survive not by growing in lush, comfortable forests, but by clinging to life in harsh, rocky soil with high winds and freezing temperatures. In fact, this adversity is what allows them to live so long. The slow growth makes their wood incredibly dense and resistant to insects, rot, and erosion. Even after a part of the tree dies, the wood can remain standing for thousands of years, sculpted by the wind into ghostly, twisted shapes. Walking through a grove of these pines is like walking through a living museum. They stand in silence, holding within their rings the climate history of the last 5 millennia, recording every wet year and every drought since the dawn of civilization. They are the silent watchers of our world, patient and enduring. While we look into the past by watching the stars, we're also sending our own past out into the universe. Since the invention of radio and television, humanity has been broadcasting signals that leak out of our atmosphere and travel into deep space at the speed of light. This expanding sphere of artificial noise is sometimes called the radiosphere. It means that a spherical shell of our history is expanding outward, currently reaching over 100 light years away. If there were a civilization with a sensitive enough receiver living on a planet 40 light years away, they wouldn't see us as we are today with the internet and smartphones. They would currently be receiving broadcasts from the 1980s. They might hear the music of that era or the news reports of the Cold War. The further out you go, the further back in time the signals get. Eventually, the signals become too faint to distinguish from the background static of the universe. But theoretically, they never truly stop. Our voices, our music, and our stories are drifting endlessly through the dark, carrying the memory of who we were to places we will never reach. A message in a bottle floating in a sea of stars. For most of history, time was defined by the movement of the earth itself, the length of a day, or the swing of a pendulum. But we eventually discovered that the earth is not a perfect timekeeper. Its rotation speeds up and slows down slightly due to tides and earthquakes. To measure time with true precision, we had to look for something much smaller and more consistent: the atom. In 1967, the definition of a second was officially changed. It is no longer a fraction of a day, but the duration of exactly 9,192,631,770 periods of radiation, corresponding to the transition between two energy levels of the cesium-133 atom. This vibration is the heartbeat of the modern world. Atomic clocks are so precise that they would not lose a second in millions of years. This precision is what allows GPS satellites to work, guiding us to our destinations. We have tethered our lives to the invisible, rhythmic humming of the building blocks of matter. It is a way of creating a perfect, unshakable order in a universe that is otherwise chaotic and drifting. A steady beat in the silence. There's a concept in geology known as deep time, a term that attempts to capture the almost incomprehensible age of our planet. It was popularized in the 18th century by a Scottish farmer and naturalist named James Hutton. While looking at rock formations at Siccar Point, he realized that the layers of stone had been laid down, tilted, eroded, and covered again over cycles that must have taken millions of years. Before this, most people believed the Earth was only a few thousand years old. Hutton looked at the rocks and famously wrote that he saw no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. Deep time humbles us. If the 4.5 billion year history of Earth were compressed into a single 24-hour day, humans would have arrived only in the very last seconds before midnight. All of our history, our wars, our art, and our lives fit into a fleeting blink in the geological eye. It is a reminder that we are guests on a planet that has existed long before us and will continue long after us. The rocks beneath our feet are the heavy, sleeping giants of history. We've explored the past through many details tonight. Knowledge builds on itself across centuries. Some things we've discovered recently, like the precise vibration of an atom. Others we've known for thousands of years, like the stories passed down through generations. And some mysteries remain unsolved, waiting quietly for someone to piece them together. We have looked at the stone beneath us and the stars above us, finding that both are archives of time. And now, as we reach the end of this journey, wherever you are and whatever time it is, I hope these thoughts have given you something gentle to rest with. The past is a quiet place, a library of all that has been, resting peacefully behind us. May your sleep be deep and peaceful,